Somewhere in the humid lowlands of what is now Guatemala, a scribe sat before a slab of limestone roughly 1,300 years ago and carved a date. Not a date for his own lifetime, not even a date for his grandchildren's lifetime. A date so far in the future that the sun would need to rise and set millions of times before it arrived. We're talking about calculations reaching thousands of years ahead, numbers so large they stretch the human imagination past the breaking point. And here's the strange part. This same civilization, capable of this kind of staggering mathematical foresight, would see many of its greatest cities emptied out, its monuments abandoned, its population scattered within just a few centuries of carving those very dates. How do you explain that? A people who could calculate time on a scale most of us can barely comprehend, who tracked the movements of Venus with an accuracy that would embarrass modern casual observers, and yet apparently couldn't see the collapse forming right in their own city squares. Or could they? That question sits at the heart of everything we're going to explore tonight. Was there something in those calendars, some hidden pattern the Maya themselves recognized, a sense that their own civilization was riding toward an ending the way every cycle rides toward an ending? Or is this something else entirely? Are we looking at ritual expectation dressed up to look like prophecy? Pattern recognition mistaken for prediction? Or maybe, and this happens more than you'd think, a modern misunderstanding layered on top of an ancient system we still don't fully understand? Because here's the thing about the Maya calendar. It wasn't one calendar. It was several interlocking, running side by side like gears in a machine built to measure eternity. And buried somewhere in that machine, in the long count dates carved into stone, in the prophetic verses recorded generations later by scribes, writing in a colonial world that had already changed everything, there might be an answer. Or there might just be more questions. That's usually how it goes with the Maya. Before we go further into the stone, the stars, and the slow unravelling of a civilization, I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight. Drop a comment and tell me your city and what time it is right there where you are. I read these every single day, and it's one of my favourite parts of making these. Someone in Manila settling in for the night, while someone in Lisbon is just waking up, all listening to the same story about people who thought about time differently than almost anyone else who ever lived. And if you find yourself drifting off to these episodes the way so many of you tell me you do, the kindest thing you can do for the channel is follow the show on Spotify and listen there. And if you're enjoying it, leave a 5-star review. That's genuinely the best way to support what we're doing here. The link is right there in the description whenever you want it. Now let's step back into the humid air of the Maya lowlands, long before anyone imagined an ending, back when the great cities were only beginning to rise. Let's start with a word: collapse. It's the word almost everyone reaches for when they talk about what happened to the Maya, and it's the word that appears in documentaries, in textbooks, in 1,000 breathless articles, asking what really happened to this vanished civilization. But here's the problem. The word does a lot of heavy lifting, and most of the time it's lifting more than it can actually carry. Think about what collapse implies. A building collapses. A bridge collapses. Something standing one moment and rubble the next. Fast, total, final. And if that's the picture in your mind when you think about the Maya, you're not entirely wrong, but you're not entirely right either. Because what happened across the Maya lowlands between roughly 750 and 950 of the Common Era wasn't a single event. It wasn't a single city falling in a single year while horrified onlookers watched the walls come down. It was something slower, messier, and honestly more interesting than that. It was a process that unfolded across 2 centuries, in different places, at different speeds, for reasons that weren't identical from one city to the next. So when historians and archaeologists use the word collapse today, and many of them still do because it's useful shorthand, they usually mean something more specific than the popular imagination assumes. They're typically talking about the breakdown of a particular political system. The royal courts, the dynasties, the kings who had ruled cities like Tikal and Calakmul and Copan and Palenque for generations, sometimes for centuries, tracing their bloodlines back through carefully recorded genealogies carved into stone. Those courts, those kingships, that entire structure of divine rulers, commissioning monuments and commanding tribute and waging war on each other, that's what came apart. Not all at once, not everywhere at the same time, but it came apart. And this is where the story gets more complicated than most people expect, because there's a difference, a real and important difference, between a political system collapsing and a people disappearing. These are not the same thing, even though popular retellings often blur them together until they sound identical. The Maya people did not vanish. They didn't walk into the jungle and disappear like smoke. Their descendants are alive today, millions of them, speaking Mayan languages, living in Guatemala and southern Mexico and Belize and Honduras, carrying forward traditions that stretch back long before any of those stone monuments were ever carved. What actually ended, was a specific way of organizing power, a specific system of kingship tied to monument building, tied to elaborate court ritual, tied to the kind of divine authority that required carved stelae proclaiming a king's greatness for eternity. So right away, we need to hold two ideas at once, and holding two ideas at once is something the human mind doesn't always love to do, but it's necessary here. The southern lowland kingdoms, the great classic period cities that had dominated the region for centuries, experienced a serious and often permanent decline. At the same time, Maya civilization as a broader cultural and linguistic reality continued. It adapted, it moved, it survived in forms that looked different from what had come before, but survival isn't the same as disappearance, and adaptation isn't the same as extinction. Now let's talk about the timeline, because the timeline itself tells us something important about how gradual and uneven this process actually was. Around 750, most of the great southern lowland cities were still functioning. Kings still ruled. Monuments were still being carved. Trade networks still connected distant cities. Populations were, in many places, at or near their historical peak. Tikal alone may have supported tens of thousands of people, and the broader region, when you count all the cities and the farmland surrounding them, likely held several million inhabitants. This wasn't a struggling civilization limping toward its end. By most measures it looked robust, even flourishing. But over the following decades, cracks started appearing. Not everywhere at once. A city here stopping its monument production a little earlier than expected. A city there showing signs of increased warfare, hastily built defensive walls, evidence of burned structures. By around 800, some cities that had once commissioned elaborate stelae every 5 years, marking important calendar anniversaries with new carved stone, simply stopped. The carving stopped, and when the carving of dated monuments stops in a city that had been doing it faithfully for centuries, that silence tells its own story. It usually means the kings who commissioned those monuments were no longer able to command the resources, the labour, or perhaps even the authority to have them made. By the early 800s, several major cities in the southern lowlands were already in serious decline. By the mid-800s, cities that had once dominated regional politics for hundreds of years had essentially gone quiet, their royal courts dissolved or diminished beyond recognition. And by around 900, the last of the long count dates carved into stone in the southern lowlands had been recorded. After that, for that region specifically, the tradition of carving dated monuments essentially ends. Not because time stopped, not because anyone forgot how to count days, but because the specific political and religious system that required those monuments, the divine kingship model, had unravelled in most of these cities. This is the window most people mean when they talk about the Maya collapse. Roughly 750 to 950. 2 centuries. Not a single catastrophic year, but 2 centuries of uneven disintegration, city by city, kingdom by kingdom, each with its own particular story, its own particular pressures, even if broader patterns connect them. And here's where it gets even more interesting, because the story doesn't end there, and it doesn't end the way the word collapse suggests it should. While the southern lowland cities were declining, cities in the northern Yucatan Peninsula, places like Chichen Itza and later Mayapan, were doing something very different. They were rising. Chichen Itza in particular became a major regional power precisely during the period when southern cities were fading, absorbing trade networks, developing new political structures, thriving in ways that look almost like a mirror image of what was happening further south. This wasn't a civilization ending. This was a civilization shifting its center of gravity, moving northward, reorganizing itself around new cities with new arrangements of power that didn't rely quite so heavily on the old divine kingship model. And Maya communities, ordinary people living in villages and towns rather than royal courts, continued living across the lowlands throughout this entire period and long after it. Farming continued. Markets continued. Languages continued, being spoken then and now. When Spanish conquistadors arrived in the region in the 1500s, centuries after the southern collapse, they didn't find empty jungle. They found Maya kingdoms still functioning, still resisting conquest fiercely, some of them for decades. The last independent Maya kingdom, in fact, held out until 1697, nearly 800 years after the southern lowland collapse had supposedly ended everything. So when we ask whether the Maya predicted their own collapse, we need to be honest about what question we're actually asking. Predicted what, exactly? The end of divine kingship in specific southern cities? The decline of monument carving traditions? A gradual multi-generational unravelling that took different forms in different places across 2 centuries? Or something grander, something closer to the popular imagination, a single dramatic ending for an entire civilization? Because those are very different claims, and they require very different kinds of evidence. If someone tells you the Maya foresaw the end of their world, you're entitled to ask, which world, whose world, and ending in what sense? The historical reality is layered and regional and stretched out across generations, and any prophecy, any prediction, any calendar date that gets held up as evidence of foresight has to be measured against that complicated, uneven, very human reality. Not against the simplified version where a civilization rises, peaks, and vanishes overnight. Keep that complexity in mind as we go forward, because it's going to matter. It's going to matter when we look at the calendars themselves, at the mathematics stretching thousands of years into the future, and at the question of whether any of it was ever meant to describe an ending at all. To understand what came apart in the southern lowlands, it helps to spend a little time in the world that existed before the strain became visible. Not the Maya world as a single empire, because it never was that. There was no Maya emperor sitting in one distant capital, sending governors out across a unified realm. No single army, no single law code, no one city that controlled all the others for very long. Instead, the classic Maya world was a landscape of rival kingdoms. Across what are now southern Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, and western Honduras, dozens of cities rose from forests, wetlands, limestone hills, and river valleys. Each had its own ruling dynasty, its own sacred places, its own allies and enemies, its own version of history carved into stone. Some kingdoms controlled broad territories, others were smaller, caught between more powerful neighbours, changing loyalties whenever the balance of power shifted. Think of it less like one empire and more like a crowded map of competing courts. Each court watched the others. Each wanted prestige, captives, trade routes, tribute, and the right marriage alliance. Each ruler needed to prove that his dynasty was not merely powerful, but necessary. That it had been chosen by the gods, descended from sacred ancestors, and placed at the centre of the universe for a reason. At the heart of this system stood the king, often called the Kuhul Ajar, the Holy Lord. This was not just a political title. A Maya king was expected to act as a bridge between the human world and the supernatural one. He performed ceremonies at important moments in the calendar. He offered blood, sometimes from his own body, in rituals meant to communicate with gods and ancestors. He appeared before his people in elaborate costumes of feathers, jade, animal skins, shells and woven cloth, transforming himself through ceremony into something more than an ordinary man. Or at least that was the claim. And claims mattered. In a world where power depended on belief, the royal family had to keep demonstrating that its rule was legitimate. A king could say that his ancestors had ruled for generations. He could commission a monument showing himself receiving authority from a long-dead predecessor. He could stage a ritual on a calendar anniversary and declare that the order of the cosmos was continuing because he, the Holy Lord, had performed his duty. The stone monuments we see in museums today, the tall carved slabs known as stelae, were part of this political language. They recorded dates, battles, accessions, marriages, rituals, and royal births. But they were not neutral records. They were public arguments, carved in stone. They said, "This king is real. This dynasty is ancient. This city is victorious. The gods still favour us." And for centuries, people had reasons to believe it. Take Tikal, deep in the lowland forests of what is now northern Guatemala. Tikal was one of the largest and most influential Maya cities, with towering pyramids rising above the canopy and broad causeways linking ceremonial spaces. Its rulers left inscriptions reaching back centuries, chronicling dynastic struggles, defeats, recoveries, alliances, and victories. At its height, Tikal was not simply a city. It was the centre of a kingdom that shaped politics across a huge part of the Maya lowlands. But Tikal was never alone at the top. To the north, in the great lowland basin of the central Maya region, stood Calakmul. Today it lies deep in the forests of the Mexican state of Campeche, surrounded by the remains of reservoirs, temples, plazas, and residential neighbourhoods. In the classic period, Calakmul was the centre of a powerful dynasty, often identified in inscriptions by the emblem of a serpent head. Its rulers built a network of allies that challenged Tikal across generations. For long stretches of Maya history, the rivalry between Tikal and Calakmul shaped the political map. Smaller cities were pulled into their orbit. A king in one place might marry into a powerful dynasty. Another might accept an alliance, receive military help, or find himself fighting on behalf of a greater neighbour. This was not a simple contest between two fixed superpowers. Alliances changed, dynasties rose and fell, but the tension was real, and it could reach far beyond the cities at its centre. Then there was Palenque in the western Maya region, set against the foothills near the edge of the Chiapas highlands. Palenque was smaller than Tikal or Calakmul, but its art and inscriptions are among the most refined the Maya ever produced. Its rulers, including the famous Kinich Janab Pakal, known today as Pakal the Great, turned architecture and writing into instruments of dynastic memory. Palenque's temples recorded royal ancestry with extraordinary care, connecting living kings to mythic events and ancestors who belonged almost as much to sacred time as to ordinary history. Far to the southeast stood Copan in what is now western Honduras. Copan flourished in a fertile valley, and its rulers created some of the most intricate sculpture in the Maya world. Its famous hieroglyphic stairway carries a long dynastic history carved across hundreds of steps. Every ruler needed a past. Copan's kings had one built in stone, one generation, adding itself to the story of those who came before. And then there was Karakol in present-day Belize. For a long time, Karakol was underestimated because its ruins remained hidden beneath forest. But archaeology revealed a vast and densely settled city with reservoirs, agricultural terraces, roads, and monumental buildings. In the 6th century, Karakol defeated Tikal in a conflict remembered in inscriptions as a major political event. That victory appears to have changed the balance of power across the central lowlands. It is a useful reminder that the Maya political world was never stable, and no city's greatness was guaranteed. These were royal capitals, but they were not isolated islands of stone. Their power depended on enormous networks of ordinary labour. Farmers cultivated maize, beans, squash, chili peppers, cacao, cotton, and fruit trees. In different environments, they adapted their methods to local conditions, using raised fields in wetlands, terracing on slopes, household gardens, forest management, and reservoirs to collect seasonal rainwater. The Maya lowlands could be productive, but they required knowledge, work, and careful coordination. A king did not personally plant maize, but his court depended on the harvest. Food supported the population. Surplus supported craft specialists, builders, scribes, priests, merchants, and warriors. It fed the labour crews that raised pyramids and paved causeways. It allowed royal households to host ceremonies, distribute gifts, and reward allies. A successful harvest did more than fill stomachs. It helped make divine kingship believable. Trade did the same thing. Maya cities exchanged goods across remarkable distances. Jade travelled from the Motagua Valley in what is now Guatemala. Obsidian, a volcanic glass used for sharp blades, came from highland sources. Marine shells moved inland from the coasts. Cacao, feathers, salt, ceramics, cotton cloth, and finely worked stone circulated through markets and elite network. These goods were useful, beautiful, and politically important. A ruler who could acquire rare jade or exotic feathers could display access to distant places and powerful relationships. Warfare was woven into this system too, not constant war in every year and every place, but regular enough that cities built defences, formed alliances, and recorded victories with pride. Maya warfare could involve raids, ambushes, sieges, and the capture of enemy nobles. Captives were valuable because they demonstrated dominance. A king shown standing over a defeated rival was making a message clear to allies and enemies alike. My dynasty is strong. My gods are with me, and resistance has consequences. But warfare was not only about territory, it was also about legitimacy. A victorious ruler could commission monuments. He could dedicate temples. He could distribute wealth. He could claim that the sacred order had been renewed through his success. Defeat, on the other hand, could be deeply destabilizing. If a king had promised divine favour and then lost a battle, lost allies, failed to provide security, or failed to sustain the ceremonies expected of him, people might begin asking a dangerous question. If the king is holy, why is the world going wrong? That question would become more important later. But before the crisis, the system could be remarkably resilient. A defeated city might recover, a dynasty might return after a period of weakness. A new alliance could redraw the map. The Maya had lived through rivalry, droughts, wars, and political reversals before. Their cities had been adapting for centuries, and all of this unfolded within a culture intensely concerned with time. Kings dated their victories, they dated their accessions. They dated the dedication of buildings, the endings of important cycles, the ceremonies that joined dynastic history to the movements of the heavens. To the Maya, time was not an empty backdrop behind human events. It was active, sacred, patterned, and full of obligation. Which brings us to the system that later became so famous, so misunderstood, and so often dragged into stories about apocalyptic predictions. The Maya calendar. The Maya calendar was not one calendar. It was several calendars working together, like a set of interlocking gears. One counted ritual days. One followed the solar year. One tracked repeating combinations of both, and one reached outward across spans of time so large they could hold the memory of creation, the reigns of kings, and dates far beyond the lifetime of anyone carving them. This matters because when people hear that the Maya thought in cycles, they sometimes imagine a culture trapped in a fatalistic loop. Everything repeats, nothing can change. If disaster comes, disaster must come. But that is not what the evidence really suggests. The Maya recognized patterns. They saw that days returned, seasons returned, celestial bodies returned to familiar positions. But recognizing a pattern is not the same as surrendering to it. A farmer knows the dry season comes every year. That does not mean he stops repairing his reservoir. A king knows a major calendar ending will arrive. That does not mean he believes his city is doomed. Quite the opposite. These moments demanded action, ritual, preparation, public displays of order. Time was not a prison. It was an obligation. The first of the major Maya calendars was the Tzolk'in, often translated as the Sacred Count. It lasted 260 days. Nobody knows for certain exactly why it had that length, though scholars have offered several possibilities. It may have reflected agricultural rhythms, human gestation, astronomical observations, or older traditions whose origins are now lost. It may have been all of these things layered together over centuries. The Tzolk'in worked through two rotating sets. One was a sequence of 20-day names. The other was a sequence of numbers from 1 through 13. Each day received one number and one name. Then both sequences moved forward together. Imagine two wheels turning at different speeds. One wheel has 13 positions. The other has 20. Today might be 4 Adjor. Tomorrow is 5 Imix. The day after that, 6 Ik. The numbers keep moving. The names keep moving. But because 13 and 20 do not line up again until 260 days have passed, the exact same combination returns only once in that entire cycle. For the Maya, these were not just labels on a page. Days had character. They carried associations, sacred qualities, and ritual possibilities. A day could be favourable for one activity and dangerous for another. Diviners used the Tzolk'in to help guide ceremonies, marriages, journeys, planting, healing, and political decisions. It was a calendar of sacred texture, not just what day is it, but what kind of day is it? Alongside it ran the Harb, a solar calendar of 365 days. The Harb had 18 named months of 20 days each, giving 360 days. Then came a short 5-day period called Wayeb. These final 5 days sat outside the normal pattern. They were often treated as a time of uncertainty, a thin and uneasy stretch at the edge of the year, when ordinary protections could feel less secure. People took precautions, ceremonies were performed. The old year was ending, but the new one had not fully arrived. You can understand the feeling. The last few days of a year can already seem strange to us. Schedules break apart, work slows down, people look backward and forward at once. For the Maya, Wayeb was that feeling made sacred and much more serious. A small gap in the order of time. The Harb helped organize the seasonal world. It connected communities to the cycle of rain, planting, growth, harvest, and dry months. But it was not perfectly aligned to the true solar year in the way a modern leap year system tries to be. Over long periods, the calendar drifted slightly relative to the seasons. That did not make it useless. It simply means the Maya were not treating the Harb as a modern scientific calendar, designed only to keep dates fixed against the sun. It had social, ceremonial, and political purposes as well. Now put the 260-day Tzolk'in and the 365-day Harb together. The same Tzolk'in day and Harb date would repeat after 18,980 days, or about 52 Harb years. This combination is called the calendar round. For an ordinary human life, 52 years was a substantial span. Many people would see one calendar round completed. Fewer would see two. A person could be born on a particular calendar round date, marry on another, become a parent, grow old, and die before that exact combination returned. So the calendar round was more than a neat mathematical trick. It gave identity to time. It placed each person and each event in a repeating web of meaningful relationships. But the Maya wanted to do something the calendar round could not do. They wanted to distinguish one great cycle from another. If a royal monument said that a king was crowned on 8 Ajor, 13K, that date would eventually repeat. 52 years later, the same combination would come around again, then again. For dynasties claiming to rule across centuries, that was not precise enough. So they used the long count. The long count was a system for counting days forward from a mythic starting point. In the most widely used correlation with our calendar, that starting point falls in 3114 BCE. But it would be misleading to call this simply the Maya version of the beginning of the world. Maya texts do connect it to creation events and the ordering of the cosmos. Yet their inscriptions also speak of time before that point and dates far beyond it. This was not a clock counting down toward an ending. It was a way of placing human events inside a vast temporal landscape. The basic units were built from days. 1 day was a kin. 20 kin made a winnel. 18 winnel made a ton. A period of 360 days. 20 ton made a Katun, about 20 years, and 20 Katun made a Baktun, about 394 years. A long count date usually appears as 5 numbers, read from the largest unit down. Something like 9.1, 6.4, Den 8. To us, it can look like a code from a science fiction control panel. But to a Maya scribe, it located an event with extraordinary precision. This many Baktuns, this many Cartoons, this many tons, this many winels, and this many days since the great starting point. That precision was power. When a ruler carved a long count date on a stela, he was not merely recording that he dedicated a building on a Tuesday. He was anchoring his reign inside cosmic time. His accession, his victory, his ritual, his marriage alliance, his capture of an enemy lord. All of it could be made to appear as part of a sacred order extending back to creation itself. It was political theatre, certainly, but not theatre in the sense of something false. The ceremonies were real, the monuments were real. The labour required to raise them was very real. The point was to show that the king could recognise the demands of time and meet them correctly. A holy lord who performed the right rites on the right date helped hold the world together. Or said he did. The most important moments were period endings, the completion of a ton, a Katun, or a larger interval was not treated like an ordinary date. It was a threshold, a hinge between one section of time and the next. Maya inscriptions often describe these endings almost as if time itself were a burden being set down, then taken up again. At these moments, kings held ceremonies, raised monuments, made offerings, and sometimes connected the new ending to anniversaries deep in the past. A ruler in the 8th century could commemorate an event that happened generations earlier, or link his own reign to mythic events associated with the beginning of the current world age. The distance between past and present did not erase the connection. If the numbers lined up, if the cycle returned, the old event could become newly relevant. And that is the key to understanding Maya time. It was cyclical, yes, but it was also cumulative. The calendar turned, but the long count kept moving. The past returned in echoes and anniversaries, while history continued forward, one counted day at a time. For Maya rulers, that made date-keeping far more than administration. It was a claim to knowledge, a claim to sacred responsibility. And eventually, as the pressures on the Maya kingdoms began to grow, those carefully counted endings would become something else as well. A record of strain, a record of silence, and in some places, the final words a dynasty ever placed on stone. But how did they actually do it? How could a Maya scribe working with bark paper books, stone carvings, painted walls, and a system of dots and bars calculate a date hundreds or even thousands of years away? The answer begins with a mathematical idea so powerful that most ancient societies never fully developed it. Place value in our own number system. The value of a digit depends on where it sits. The 5 in 5 means 5. The 5 in 50 means 5 tens. The 5 in 500 means 5 hundreds. Move the symbol one place to the left and its value changes. The Maya used the same basic principle, though their system was usually based on 20s rather than 10s. A single dot meant 1, 2 dots meant 2, up to 4 dots meant 4. A horizontal bar meant 5, so 1 bar and 3 dots meant 8. 3 bars and 4 dots meant 19. Simple, compact, easy to carve into stone. But then the symbols could be stacked vertically. The lowest position represented single days, kin. The position above it represented groups of 20 days, winals. Above that came the ton, normally representing 360 days. Then katuns, then baktuns. The same small collection of dots and bars could express numbers of extraordinary size, depending on where they were placed. It was a little like having a tiny set of building blocks that could be arranged into a hut, a palace, or a mountain. And the Maya had another crucial tool, 0. They represented it with a distinctive sign, often resembling a shell. The exact artistic form varied from place to place and period to period, but the concept was clear. A position in the count could be empty. Nothing occupied that place. 0. This may sound ordinary because 0 is so familiar to us. It sits on calculators. It appears on clocks. Children learn it before they fully understand multiplication. But 0 is not an obvious invention. It requires a strange and abstract leap. You must recognize that nothing can still be something worth recording. Without 0, a positional system becomes awkward. Imagine trying to write the difference between 101 and 11 if you have no way to show that the middle position is empty. You can do it perhaps, but not cleanly, not reliably, not in a way that lets scribes calculate across centuries without confusion. The Maya had that tool, and with it they could count forward and backward through immense spans of time. Now, the long count was not quite a pure base 20 system. Most positions worked in 20s. 20 kin made 1 winal. 20 ton made 1 katun. 20 katun made 1 baktun. But there was one adjustment near the bottom. Instead of 20 winals making a ton, there were 18. 18 winals of 20 days gave 360 days. That number sits close to the solar year. Not exactly 365 days, but close enough to make the ton feel like a year-sized unit, a humanly meaningful block of time. The Maya were not simply building an abstract number machine. They were connecting mathematics to the movement of the seasons, the rituals of kingship, and the measured passage of human lives. A trained scribe could take a known date, add a number of days, and arrive at a future position in the count. He could also move in the other direction, reaching back toward earlier creation events, ancestral milestones, and mythic time. This was not fortune-telling, it was arithmetic. But arithmetic in Maya society was never merely arithmetic. Picture a royal court during the classic period. A king wants to dedicate a temple, or celebrate the completion of a Katun, or establish that his dynasty has endured through a chain of ancestors stretching into the deep past. Scribes consult the counts, they compare dates, they identify anniversaries, period endings, and meaningful combinations in the ritual calendar. Then the result is carved. On stelae, the tall stone monuments raised in plazas, dates often appear before the story they frame. First comes the precise location in time, then the king's accession, his ritual dance, his military victory, the capture of an enemy, the dedication of a shrine, the birth or death of a royal relative. Time came first because time gave the event its authority. A similar pattern appears on stairways and temple inscriptions. At places like Palenque, Copan, Quirigua, and Yaxchilan, texts could connect the present ruler to ancestors, gods, dynastic founders, and future calendar stations. A temple was not just a building, it could become a statement written into time itself. Some inscriptions even project forward beyond the lives of the people who ordered them carved. This is where modern readers sometimes get excited. They see a date centuries in the future and assume the Maya must have believed they knew what would happen then. But that is usually not what the inscription says. A future date could be calculated because the calendar system was designed to count forward. If you know where you are in a sequence and you know how the units work, you can identify where the sequence will be after another Katun, another Baktun, another vast interval of counted days. We do the same thing, though we rarely make it sound mysterious. We can say that January 1, 2500 will fall on a Friday if the calendar rules remain the same. That does not mean we know who will rule in 2500, whether cities will stand, or whether anyone will care about Fridays. It only means the calendar can be projected. For the Maya, though, the act of projection carried more weight than it does for us. To name a distant future period ending was to show that the structure of time extended beyond one reign, one dynasty, one city, perhaps even one age of the world. The king who sponsored the text could present himself as a caretaker of an order larger than his own mortality. That was useful politics. A ruler dies, a dynasty may face rivals. Reign may fail, war may be approaching. Yet the monument stands in the plaza, calmly announcing that the cycles continue. The next period ending will arrive. The rites will have their appointed place. The cosmos has not slipped into chaos. At least, that was the claim. And it was a powerful claim because Maya kingship depended partly on the belief that rulers could communicate with sacred forces and fulfill obligations at the dangerous thresholds of time. A king did not create the calendar. He demonstrated that he understood it. He marked its turning points correctly. He performed the ceremonies required when one burden of time ended and another began. The farther into the future a text could reach, the more impressive that claim became. At Palenque, inscriptions associated with the ruler Kinich, Janab, Pakal and his dynasty reach far beyond his own lifetime. One famous text projects to a calendar anniversary in what corresponds, under the usual correlation, to the year 4772 CE. The text does not offer a detailed vision of that year. It does not describe famine, conquest, collapse, or salvation. It marks a distant calendrical station and ties it symbolically to Pakal. That is the important part. The future date honoured the ruler. It extended his presence through the machinery of time. In effect, the inscription says, this king belonged to a pattern so durable that even an event thousands of years away can be connected to him. That is not a prediction in the modern sense. It is dynastic theology expressed through numbers. Maya scribes were also careful observers of the sky. They tracked the movements of the sun, moon, Venus, and other celestial bodies with remarkable dedication. Surviving manuscripts, especially the Dresden Codex, preserve tables used to follow lunar intervals and the complicated visible cycle of Venus. Such knowledge could help schedule rituals, interpret celestial events, and coordinate ceremonial life. But here again, we need to separate two things that can look similar from a distance. The ability to predict an eclipse or calculate the return of Venus is a real form of astronomical prediction. It is based on observed cycles. The ability to calculate that a future date will occur is also real. It is based on counting. Neither automatically means a scribe believed he could foresee a particular political disaster 400 years away. A calendar can tell you when a threshold arrives. It cannot tell you what a frightened king will do when the rains fail, when enemies gather at the border, when tribute stops arriving, or when people begin leaving the countryside. The Maya could count astonishingly far into the future. They could place royal lives against the scale of creation. They could turn dots, bars, and a small shell-shaped zero into dates that reached beyond any imaginable human lifespan. But counting the future and knowing the future were not the same thing. And that distinction becomes especially important when we turn to the Maya inscriptions that seem, at first glance, to speak directly across the centuries. And the most famous of these inscriptions begins at Palenque. Palenque was one of the great cities of the Western Maya world, built among the green hills of what is now Chiapas. Its temples rose above the forest on stepped stone platforms. Its rulers left behind some of the longest, most elegant, and most complicated inscriptions in the Maya world. At the centre of this tradition stands the Temple of the Inscriptions, the monument associated with the ruler Kinich, Janab Pakal, better known simply as Pakal. Pakal ruled Palenque for nearly 70 years, from 615 to 683 CE. By Maya standards, this was an astonishingly long reign. He came to the throne as a child during a difficult period for the city, and he died as an old man after transforming Palenque into a powerful ceremonial centre. The temple built over his tomb was meant to preserve more than his bones. It preserved his place in time. Its inscriptions move through centuries of dynastic history. They name ancestors. They record accessions, births, deaths, and ritual events. They connect Pakal's family to sacred figures and to the deep mythic past. The message is not subtle. Pakal was not an isolated king who happened to rule for a long time. He was the latest, and perhaps greatest, link in a chain that reached back toward creation itself. Then the text does something remarkable. It looks forward. One passage projects to a future calendar station corresponding under the most widely used correlation between Maya and modern calendars to the year 4772 CE. That is almost 3,000 years after Pakal's death. For a moment it can feel eerie. A king buried in a stone chamber in the 7th century seems to be speaking about a date in a future beyond our own lifetime, beyond the lives of our grandchildren, beyond political systems, nations, languages, and perhaps even the cities we know. But what does the inscription actually say? Not very much about the future itself. It identifies a huge period ending, the completion of a pictune, a unit made up of 20 backtunes. It appears to connect that distant anniversary with Pakal and with ritual clothing or ceremonial identity. The exact grammar and meaning of parts of the passage remain debated. Maya epigraphy is a field full of careful reconstruction, damaged signs, alternate readings, and arguments conducted one glyph at a time. But no plausible reading turns it into a warning of apocalypse. There is no description of a dying world, no prediction of famine, no announcement that Palenque will fall, no list of future kings, no secret timetable for the destruction of Maya civilization. The point is much closer to this. Pakal's importance was so great that his memory could be carried forward to a future turning point in the calendar. Think of the difference between saying, "In the year 3000, this cathedral will be 1000 years old," and saying, "In the year 3000, the world will end." The first is a commemorative projection. It marks an anniversary, it gives the building, its founders, and its history a place in a long timeline. The second is prophecy. Modern readers often see a distant date and assume the second meaning. Maya inscriptions usually give us the first. Other monuments make the same point in even grander fashion. At Cobar, in the northeastern Yucatan Peninsula, one famous stela contains a long count date with so many positions that it reaches into spans of time almost impossible to picture. The numbers extend far beyond ordinary historical chronology, beyond dynasties, cities, and even the age of the present world. It has sometimes been described as the Maya reaching into the unimaginably distant future. But that description needs care. The Cobar text is generally understood as projecting backward toward an immensely remote creation event, not forward toward a specific coming disaster. Its purpose seems to be cosmological. It places the world known to the Maya inside a timescale so vast that even the 13 Baktun creation era becomes only one chapter in a much larger numerical universe. This is not a countdown, it is a declaration that time is bigger than human history. At Quirigua, in what is now Guatemala, inscriptions also link historical rulers to enormous cycles. The city's stone monuments are famous for their scale. Some stelae are taller than a 2-story house, covered on every side with carved rulers, gods, dates, and dense columns of glyphs. Quirigua's texts look back to the creation date of 13.0, the beginning of the current world era in Maya thought. That same date was also associated with the later completion of 13 Baktuns, the event that fell in 2012, according to the usual modern conversion. This is where the confusion begins. To us, a date like 13.0 can look like a fixed destination. The end of a long numerical sequence, a final page. But to the Maya, period endings were not necessarily final pages. They were turning points. When one Katun ended, another began. When a larger period reached completion, ritual obligations became especially important. The count did not run off a cliff. It continued. A Maya monument could name such a future completion because it was mathematically available, ritually meaningful, and politically useful. Naming it did not require a vision of what would happen on that day. The famous 2012 reference from Tortuguero, a site in Tabasco, follows this pattern. Monument 6, now broken and incomplete, refers to the ending of the 13th Baktun. The surviving text appears to associate that period ending with the descent or display of a deity called Bolon Yokte. That sounds dramatic, and it probably was meant to sound dramatic. Ritual language often is. Gods appear. Sacred bundles are displayed. Thrones are prepared. Ceremonies mark transitions in time. But the damaged inscription does not say that the earth would be destroyed. It does not say that humanity would vanish. It does not say that the Maya knew their cities would collapse centuries earlier. It describes a calendrical and ritual event, not an apocalypse. This distinction matters because Maya texts were written in a world where time carried sacred force. A period ending was not like turning a page in an office calendar. It was more like arriving at a powerful threshold, one that required the proper ceremonies, offerings, and royal performances. Kings wanted to be seen standing at those thresholds. They wanted their names attached to past anniversaries and future ones. They wanted their monuments to declare that their rule fit the deep order of the cosmos. A future date, then, was often a form of royal self-promotion. The king says, in effect, my dynasty belongs to a sequence that began before ordinary history and will continue after my body is gone. My rituals are not temporary. My authority has a place in the machinery of the universe. And yet there was also something fragile beneath that claim. A monument could promise continuity. A calendar could name the next great turning point. But neither stone nor arithmetic could guarantee that the king's descendants would still rule when it arrived. That gap between cosmic order and human survival would become painfully important in the centuries ahead. That gap becomes easier to understand when we look at one of the Maya's most important units of time, the Katun. A Katun was a period of 7,200 days, just under 20 solar years. Long enough that a child present at one Katun ending might be a parent, or even a grandparent, by the next. It was not an abstract number buried in the calculations of elite scribes. It was a major public interval, a piece of time with political, religious, and emotional weight. For a Maya ruler, completing a Katun was an opportunity. It meant ceremonies, offerings, processions, feasting, perhaps, the dedication of buildings, the raising of carved stone monuments. It was a moment when the king could stand before the community and demonstrate that the world was still in order, that the calendar had advanced correctly, that the gods had received their due, and that royal authority remained connected to the turning of time. Maya inscriptions are filled with these endings. They record dates with astonishing precision, then often tell us that a ruler performed a ritual. He scattered incense. He offered blood. He set up a stone. He dedicated an altar. He wore the costume of a deity or ancestor. The specific ceremony could vary from place to place, and many details are lost to us. But the larger pattern is clear. When time reached an important station, rulers were expected to do something. This was not just celebration, it was maintenance. The Maya lived in a universe that required care. The movements of the sun, moon, planets, seasons, ancestors, gods, rulers, and crops all belonged in different ways to an ordered system. Ceremonies did not merely observe that order from a safe distance. They helped renew it, at least that was the hope. Imagine living in a farming society where rain arrives unpredictably, where a failed harvest can become a disaster, where war can close trade routes, where illness can move through crowded communities, and where rulers claim special access to the sacred forces behind the visible world. A Katun ending would not feel like a date on a wall calendar. It would feel like a threshold, and thresholds are uneasy places. They are moments when old arrangements have ended but new ones have not fully begun. Moments when the right ritual matters more than usual. Moments when people may wonder whether the next cycle will bring abundance, war, stability, sickness, or change. This is where Maya ideas about recurring time can begin to sound like prophecy. Not prophecy in the modern sense of a precise forecast. Not on this exact future day, this kingdom will fall. Maya inscriptions do not give us that kind of warning about the classic collapse. But Maya time was not imagined as empty. Periods could have character. Days carried names and sacred associations. Larger cycles were linked to divine patrons, ritual obligations, and remembered patterns. If a particular named period had been associated with conflict, hardship, political upheaval, or renewal in the past, people might expect similar forces to matter when that period returned. The future, in other words, could be read through the shape of the past. Think of it less like a weather forecast and more like a season. If winter is coming, you do not know the exact day the first storm will arrive. You do not know which roof will leak or which road will close. But you know winter has its own character. You prepare differently. You store food. You repair the house. You pay attention to signs in the sky. For the Maya, a returning calendar period may have carried something like that expectation. Not an unchangeable fate, but a tendency, a sacred atmosphere, a set of risks and responsibilities, and that distinction matters. A ritual expectation can feel deeply predictive without being a fixed prediction. If people believe a new Katun may bring instability, they may perform more elaborate ceremonies, seek signs from diviners, make political alliances, or worry about whether their ruler is strong enough to guide the community through the transition. But none of this means they possessed a calendar that mechanically announced the destruction of their civilization 4 centuries in advance. The Maya were extremely skilled calculators of time. They could project dates far into the past and future. They could connect historical events to great cycles. They could recognize patterns in dynastic fortune, warfare, weather, and ritual life. That is not the same as knowing exactly what would happen. In fact, the elaborate ceremonies at period endings suggest the opposite. If the future were fully fixed, there would be little point in renewing the world through ritual. The very act of making offerings implies that human action still mattered. A king's performance, a community's participation, the proper honouring of gods and ancestors. These might help carry society safely across a dangerous boundary. Or so people hoped during the Classic period. Especially between roughly 250 and 900 CE, rulers used period endings to make that hope visible in stone. A stela raised at a calendrical completion was not only a historical record. It was a claim. It said that this king had been present at the right moment. This king had fulfilled the required rites. This king had linked his dynasty to the continuing movement of sacred time. And it also said something more fragile. Please remember this. Please recognize that order continues. Please believe that the ruler still has the power to renew it. That last message may have become harder to sustain as the classic Maya world entered its centuries of strain. If harvests failed, if enemies attacked, if rival dynasties captured kings, then a monument celebrating cosmic order could begin to feel less reassuring than it once had. Still, the idea of Katun destiny did not disappear with the decline of many southern lowland cities. It became especially important later in the northern Yucatan Peninsula, where Maya communities preserved and reshaped older calendrical traditions under radically different historical conditions. There, in colonial-era manuscripts known as the Books of Chilam Balam, Katuns would be remembered not only as intervals of time, but as periods with recognizable fates. Some would be linked to prosperity, others to war, hunger, foreign domination, or political change. These later texts are among the main reasons people speak of Maya Katun prophecies today. But they come from a world very different from that of Palenque, Quiriguá, or Tortuguero. They were written down after the Spanish invasion, after epidemics, forced labour, Christian conversion, and the collapse of the old political order. So before we use them as evidence for what the ancient Maya supposedly predicted, we need to meet the strange, layered and elusive books in which those predictions survive. The books are called the Books of Chilam Balam. That name sounds like the title of one ancient volume, locked away in a temple somewhere, waiting to reveal what the Maya knew about the future. The reality is stranger and much more complicated. There is no single book of Chilam Balam. There are several surviving manuscripts, named for Yucatec Maya towns, where they were preserved or discovered. The books of Chilam Balam of Chumayel, Tizimin, Mani, Kawa, and Ixil are the best known. Most were written down in the colonial period, usually between the 17th and 18th centuries, long after Spanish armies, missionaries, epidemics, and colonial officials had transformed the Maya world. They are not neat books in the modern sense, they are compilations, collections assembled over time by different hands. One page may contain a calendar sequence, another may preserve a prophecy. Then come medicinal recipes, Christian prayers, local histories, astronomical material, Spanish-style almanacs, lists of saints, land records, or fragments of older Maya knowledge translated into a new colonial world. Think of them less like a single sacred scripture and more like a family attic. Inside, you find objects from different generations. An old heirloom, a newer letter, a record of disaster, a prayer borrowed from a neighbour, something copied so many times that nobody is entirely sure what the original looked like. Everything in the attic is real in some sense. But not everything comes from the same time, and not everything means now what it meant when it was first placed there. The word Chilam referred to a ritual specialist, someone associated with divination, prophecy, and sacred interpretation. The word Balam is often understood as a personal name, perhaps connected with the Maya word for jaguar. Later tradition remembered a figure called Chilam Balam as a prophet who had foretold the coming of foreigners. Whether there was one historical prophet behind that memory is difficult to establish. There may have been, or there may have been several ritual specialists whose roles and sayings gradually became attached to one famous name. Colonial Maya communities living through invasion and upheaval had every reason to preserve stories of seers who had warned that immense change was coming. And so the name became powerful. A Chilam was not simply someone predicting the future like a modern fortune teller. He was a person trained to read signs, calendar signs, sacred days, ritual patterns, perhaps omens in weather, illness, war, or political events. His task was to interpret the character of time. That brings us back to the Katun. In the books of Chilam Balam, particular Katuns are often described as if they have personalities, dangers, and tendencies of their own. A Katun might be associated with famine, war, political disorder, heavy tribute, disease, foreign rule, or the collapse of established authority. Another might bring abundance, good harvests, powerful leaders, or renewed stability. These passages are the closest thing we have to what people usually call Maya prophecies of history. But they are elusive. A prophecy for a Katun does not usually say, in the year 830, a drought will destroy these named cities, and this dynasty will disappear. It is broader than that, more atmospheric. A certain Katun may be described as a time when rulers are weak, when people suffer, when there is hunger in the land, when conflict spreads, or when outsiders arrive. That can sound remarkably predictive after a disaster has happened. And that is exactly why we need to be careful. Imagine reading a sentence that says, "There will be hardship, quarrels among leaders, and hunger." In a stable year it may seem vague. In a year of drought and war, it can seem terrifyingly precise. Human beings are very good at fitting broad warnings to specific events, especially when those events are painful enough to demand an explanation. The Maya were not alone in this. Many cultures have treated recurring periods as times with recognizable moods. A bad season, an unlucky year, an era of disorder. The point is not necessarily that every event is fixed in advance. The point is that time itself has a pattern, and wise people should know how to move through it. The colonial books preserve this way of thinking, but they do not give us a clean window into the minds of classic period Maya living 400 years before the great decline of southern lowland cities. There are several reasons for that. First, the manuscripts were written centuries after the events people now call the classic Maya collapse. The last great inscriptions of many southern cities belong mainly to the 8th and 9th centuries. The books of Chilam Balam were copied in a very different Maya world after the conquest of Yucatan in the 16th century. That is a gap of many generations. Second, the books were written with the Roman alphabet introduced by the Spanish in Yucatec Maya. Classic inscriptions, meanwhile, used the older Maya hieroglyphic writing system and often reflect languages and political traditions from other regions. The people who copied the books may have preserved very old knowledge. They may also have reshaped it, misunderstood parts of it, or adapted it to make sense of their own catastrophes. And they had lived through catastrophes. The Spanish invasion was not one event that ended on one day. It was a long process of military pressure, forced resettlement, tribute demands, religious conversion, violence, and epidemic disease. Communities watched old rulers lose authority. They watched churches rise beside or on top of older sacred places. They saw population collapse on a scale that must have felt like the end of an age. Under those conditions, a prophecy about a troubled Katun could acquire new meanings. A passage once connected to ordinary political instability might become a warning about conquest. A phrase about tribute might come to describe colonial taxation. A reference to strangers might be read through the arrival of Spaniards. Even older material could be filtered through the memory of a world shattered and remade. Then there is the problem of copying. The surviving manuscripts are not original dictations from some ancient prophet. They are copies of copies, sometimes incomplete, sometimes damaged, sometimes written by scribes whose own knowledge was changing. A line may preserve an ancient formula, or it may contain a later explanation. Or it may blend both together so tightly that nobody can separate them with confidence. Translation adds another layer. Yucatec Maya words can carry meanings that do not fit neatly into English. Terms for rulership, burden, famine, divinity, fate, and ritual obligation may have several shades of meaning. Some passages are poetic, compressed, repetitive, or deliberately obscure. A translator must make choices, and each choice can make a text sound more definite, more mystical, or more predictive than the original language may require. So the books of Chilam Balam are not useless evidence. Far from it, they are extraordinary records of Maya intellectual survival. They show that Maya communities continued to preserve calendars, sacred history, ritual knowledge, and ways of reading recurring time even under colonial rule. They show how people used the past to understand disaster. They show that Katuns could be remembered as periods with their own dangers and obligations. But they cannot simply be carried backward across centuries and treated as a direct warning written for the rulers of classic Tikal, Copan, or Calakmul. The books tell us more securely about the Maya who copied them than about a single unchanged prophecy from the distant past. Still, they raise a fascinating possibility. If later Maya communities understood history as a cycle of recurring hardship, political failure, hunger, and renewal, then perhaps earlier Maya rulers also recognized that kingdoms could rise, weaken, and fall, not because they had foreseen one exact collapse, but because they had already seen smaller versions of it happen before. And that is where we need to look next. The Maya did not need to predict one enormous collapse in order to understand that power could fail. They had seen it happen before, not necessarily on the scale that would unfold across parts of the southern lowlands in the 9th century. Not all at once. Not as one clean dramatic event with a beginning and an end. But Maya political life had always involved reversals. A king died. A dynasty lost a war. A rival city captured a sacred prisoner. Trade routes shifted. A royal family disappeared from the monuments. A place that had once raised towering temples fell quiet, while another centre, perhaps only a few days away by foot, suddenly began building larger plazas and recording victories. For the people living through these changes, history would not have looked like a straight road leading ever upward. It would have looked more like the rainy season. Clouds gather. Fields turn green. Water fills the reservoirs. Then, sometimes slowly and sometimes without warning, the rains fail. The ground hardens, the crops weaken, and everyone remembers that rain has failed before. This is the cautious possibility behind the idea that earlier Maya may have recognized cycles of decline. They could observe patterns. They could remember disasters. They could preserve the names of defeated rulers and abandoned places. They could notice that periods of conflict often brought tribute demands, disrupted farming, population movement and hunger. They could see that one generation's great king did not guarantee the safety of the next. That is not the same thing as supernatural prediction. It is historical memory, and historical memory can be powerful enough to feel like prophecy. Imagine a royal court in the early classic period, centuries before the famous decline of cities such as Tikal, Copan, or Palenque. The scribes are recording accessions, victories, marriages, rituals, and anniversaries. They are also recording defeats, though usually more carefully. Kings did not enjoy carving monuments that announced their own humiliation. But defeat could not always be hidden. Captured nobles appeared in the art of rival kingdoms. A ruler vanished from local records. Building projects stopped. A dynasty changed direction. The Maya were skilled readers of signs because their world demanded it. A farmer watched the sky. A priest tracked the sacred calendar. A ruler listened for news from neighbouring courts. A merchant noticed which roads had become dangerous. A scribe knew the names of ancestors whose victories still justified the authority of the living king. All of them, in different ways, lived with the past. The word collapse can make us imagine that nobody saw anything coming. One day, the cities are full. The next day, vines are growing through empty plazas. But that is not how large societies usually come apart. Stress arrives in pieces, a few bad harvests, a war that lasts too long, a new ruler with weak allies, more labour demanded for defences, palaces and temples, refugees arriving from a troubled district, fewer goods in the market, a reservoir lower than it should be, a noble family switching its loyalty to a rival king. Any one of these problems might be survivable. Together, over decades, they can change everything. Earlier Maya communities may have recognized these smaller cycles of strain and recovery. In fact, the Maya political landscape was full of them. Cities rose to prominence and then faded. Dynasties sometimes endured for centuries, but others ended abruptly. Alliances shifted. Former enemies became ritual partners, then enemies again. The great capitals of the classic period were not timeless nations with fixed borders. They were competing courts, held together through kinship, warfare, ceremony, trade, and the continuing ability of kings to deliver order. When that ability failed, people could move. This matters because the eventual decline of many southern lowland kingdoms was not entirely without precedent. Maya people had long experience with changing centres of power. A place could lose its ruler, its monuments, or its importance without every person in the region vanishing. Families could relocate. New leaders could emerge elsewhere. Sacred traditions could continue even after one royal court had fallen silent. So perhaps some Maya understood political ruin as a recurring feature of time. Not inevitable. Not precisely scheduled, but always possible. There is a difference between saying, this kingdom will fall exactly 400 years from now, and saying kingdoms fall when the balance breaks. The first claim requires evidence we do not have. The second is almost certainly true. Still, the surviving evidence from the early classic period is frustratingly incomplete. We have stone monuments, carved stairways, painted ceramics, temple inscriptions, and fragments of texts. They can tell us a remarkable amount about royal genealogy, warfare, ritual dates, alliances, and sacred history. But they were not written as neutral chronicles for future historians. They were political documents. A monument often tells us what a king wanted remembered. It records his accession, his ancestor, his victory, his ritual authority. If there had been drought, hunger, rebellion, or fear at court, those subjects might be absent entirely. Silence on stone does not prove peace in the countryside, and much has been lost. Maya books made from bark paper once existed in great numbers. Spanish clergy destroyed many of them during the colonial period, seeing them as dangerous remnants of non-Christian religion. Only a handful of pre-Columbian Maya codices survive today. Countless painted walls have eroded, wooden objects decayed in the humid lowlands. Buildings were rebuilt over older buildings, hiding or destroying earlier inscriptions. What remains is extraordinary, but it is only a fraction. That means we cannot point to an early classic text and say, with confidence, here is a Maya warning about the decline that would come 4 centuries later. No known inscription gives us that kind of forecast. No surviving document lays out a timetable for the abandonment of the southern cities. The honest answer is quieter. Earlier Maya probably knew that droughts could return. They probably knew that wars could spiral beyond anyone's control. They certainly knew that royal houses could lose power, and that old centres could be replaced by new ones. Their calendars gave them a language for recurring time. Their histories gave them examples of reversal. Their religion gave cosmic meaning to instability. But recognizing recurring danger is not the same as foreseeing a specific disaster. It is more like standing beside a reservoir at the end of a dry season. You may not know the exact day the water will run out. You may not know whether rains will come early, late, or not at all. But you know what an empty reservoir means. And the Maya were watching more than their histories. They were watching the sky. Above them, every night, the sky returned. The same bright planets, the same slow-turning moon, the same stars rising in their seasons. For Maya farmers, priests, scribes, and kings, this was not empty darkness. It was a vast clock, moving with a precision that human life could only try to imitate. And the Maya were exceptionally patient clock readers. They tracked the cycles of Venus, the movements of the moon, the coming and going of eclipses, and the yearly changes that brought rain, planting, harvest, and uncertainty. Their surviving books and inscriptions show mathematical systems capable of following celestial patterns across spans of time far beyond a single human lifetime. Venus was especially important. To modern eyes, Venus is just the brilliant light that appears near sunrise or sunset. But to Maya astronomers, it was a powerful and sometimes dangerous presence. It vanished beneath the horizon, reappeared in a new position, and followed a cycle that could be counted. The Venus table in the Dresden Codex, one of the few surviving Maya books, tracks intervals in Venus's appearances with remarkable care. The planet's cycle was linked to ritual timing, political action, and perhaps warfare. Some Maya scholars have noticed that attacks and military events were sometimes associated with particular Venus stations. That does not mean every war began, because somebody saw Venus in the morning sky. Politics was never that simple, but the heavens offered rulers a sacred schedule. If a king wanted to begin a campaign, dedicate a building, perform a dangerous rite, or announce a new phase of power, the movement of Venus could make that action feel cosmically authorized. The sky did not merely reflect events. In Maya thought, it helped give them meaning. The moon was watched with similar care. Maya inscriptions often include what scholars call lunar series, records that place an event within the lunar cycle. They noted the age of the moon, counted lunations, and connected royal ceremonies to a larger pattern moving overhead. Eclipses too mattered deeply. An eclipse was not an ordinary event. The sun or moon appeared threatened, obscured, disturbed. In a world where kings were expected to maintain balance between the human community and the sacred order, such moments demanded attention. The surviving eclipse tables do not read like simple weather reports or modern scientific predictions. They are more complicated than that. Maya scribes worked with repeating intervals, using mathematics to identify periods when eclipses might occur. They were tracking a pattern in the relationship between sun, moon, and earth, even if their explanations of that pattern belonged to a sacred worldview, very different from our own. And this is worth pausing over. The Maya could calculate astonishing things. They could project calendar dates far into the future. They could follow Venus through cycles that stretched across generations. They could identify eclipse seasons. But none of this gave them a magical view of everything that would happen on Earth. Knowing when Venus might rise is not the same as knowing when a kingdom will fail. Knowing that eclipses recur is not the same as knowing that drought will empty reservoirs 2 centuries later. The astronomical tables are evidence of careful observation, mathematics, ritual knowledge, and intellectual discipline. They are not evidence that Maya priests had discovered a hidden celestial formula for societal collapse. Still, watching the sky may have taught them something important about the nature of danger. Patterns return. The dry season returns. The rains return. Venus disappears and returns. The moon grows, fades, vanishes, and comes back. A ruler dies, and another takes his place. A city wins a war, then loses one. The Maya did not necessarily assume that every event repeated exactly, but they lived in a universe where recurrence was fundamental. The past was not gone, it was always moving toward another appearance. And no pattern mattered more to ordinary life than the pattern of rain. The Maya lowlands could be fertile, but they were also vulnerable. Much of the region had no great permanent rivers flowing through the centres of power. Communities depended on seasonal rainfall, wetlands, springs, reservoirs, household storage, and carefully managed landscapes. Rain determined whether maize would grow. It determined whether water jars could be filled, whether food stores would last, whether people could travel, trade, build, and survive the dry months. So the changing sky was never just a subject for elite curiosity. It was a matter of food. Farmers watched clouds gathering at the horizon. They watched the first storms of the wet season. They knew the danger of rain arriving too late, ending too early, or falling too hard in a brief destructive burst, rather than soaking steadily into the soil. A year with poor rainfall was not automatically a catastrophe. Families had strategies, communities stored food and water. Different places had different resources, but repeated bad years could become something much worse. This is where ritual entered the picture. Maya rulers presented themselves as mediators between their people and the sacred forces governing the world. They performed ceremonies at calendar endings, during seasonal transitions, and at moments of celestial significance. They offered blood, incense, food, prayer, and spectacle. They called upon deities associated with rain, maize, ancestors, and the ordered movement of time. If the rains came, royal ritual could be understood as part of a properly maintained world. If the rains failed, the problem was not merely agricultural. It was political. A king who could not protect his people from hunger faced a crisis of legitimacy, even if no ruler could control the weather. His enemies might claim that he had lost divine favour. His allies might hesitate. His subjects might resist tribute demands or leave for a place with better water and stronger leadership. The same drought that weakened maize fields could weaken the invisible bonds holding a kingdom together. By the way, if you enjoy these quiet historical mysteries, the channel's book about the 12 unexplained mysteries is available on the website, with the link in the description. It explores the kind of questions that history leaves partly answered, where the evidence is real, but the final certainty remains just beyond reach. For the Maya, environmental knowledge was not neatly separated from religion, mathematics, farming, and government. A court astronomer, a calendar priest, and a royal advisor may have occupied overlapping worlds. Their calculations could tell them when a sacred interval ended. Their observations could show that the seasonal rhythm had shifted. Their inherited traditions could preserve memories of earlier shortages or disasters. Could they have noticed longer environmental patterns? Possibly human communities living in one landscape for centuries can become extremely sensitive to changes that outsiders barely see. A sequence of weak, rainy seasons, a reservoir that refills less completely, a planting date that no longer works as reliably as it once did, a familiar bird arriving at a different time. These are not necessarily written down in surviving stone inscriptions, but they may have been known in farming households, repeated in ritual speech, and discussed in royal courts. What the evidence does not allow us to say is that Maya astronomers looked at Venus, calculated an eclipse, and announced that the classic Maya kingdoms would collapse 400 years in the future. That story is more dramatic than the truth. The truth is that they had every reason to fear drought. They had sophisticated systems for measuring time. They understood that celestial cycles could be predicted with extraordinary accuracy. And their rulers carried the burden of proving that the world remained in balance. But the sky could offer a calendar. It could not refill a reservoir. And as the centuries passed, the reservoirs, the rains, and the increasingly crowded landscape would become impossible to ignore. The Maya had learned to live with this problem for centuries. The southern lowlands were not a desert, far from it. In the wet season, rain could arrive in tremendous quantities. Forests grew thick, fields of maize, beans, squash, chili, and cacao could support large populations. Wetlands filled, reservoirs rose, the landscape could look almost endlessly green. But that green world had a difficult secret. For several months each year, the rains became weak or stopped altogether, and much of the southern Maya lowlands sits on limestone. Rainwater sinks quickly through cracked and porous ground, disappearing into underground channels rather than remaining on the surface. In many of the great classic Maya cities, there were no large, dependable rivers running beside the royal palaces. There was rain, there were seasonal pools, there were wetlands, and there were carefully engineered places to store water. But there was no simple guarantee. A city like Tikal, deep in the lowlands, had to collect the wet season and make it last through the dry one. That meant reservoirs. Maya engineers shaped plazas, pavements, channels, embankments, and catchment areas so rainfall could be directed into artificial basins. At some sites, reservoirs were lined with clay or other materials to reduce seepage. Water was not just gathered, it had to be protected from erosion, sediment, and contamination. In densely occupied cities, clean water was a matter of planning, labour, and constant maintenance. Imagine the calculation behind it. How much rain fell this year? How much had been stored? How many people needed it? How long until the next reliable storms? And what happened if the rains arrived late? For households, the question was equally immediate. Water could be kept in jars and smaller storage features. People used local springs where they existed. They drew on wetlands. In some areas, they used chultons, underground or bottle-shaped chambers that could store water or food. Farmers adjusted planting schedules to the familiar rhythm of the seasons. But all these strategies worked best when the familiar rhythm held. The lowland soils also had limits. Some areas had rich, productive earth, especially near wetlands and river valleys. Other soils were thin, easily exhausted, or difficult to farm intensively. Maya communities used a wide range of methods: small household gardens, raised fields in suitable wetlands, terracing in hillier regions, managed forest resources, and different forms of maize cultivation. They were not helpless victims wandering through an unforgiving jungle. They were skilled landscape managers, but skill does not make a landscape invulnerable. As populations grew and royal centres became larger, the margin for error may have narrowed. More people meant more mouths to feed, more land under cultivation, more fuel wood needed for cooking and producing lime plaster, more labour demanded for temples, roads, reservoirs, and warfare. A small farming village can sometimes move, diversify, or endure a poor harvest through kin networks. A capital city with tens of thousands of people, a royal court, nobles, craft specialists, and surrounding dependent communities has more complicated needs. Its water system has to keep working, its food system has to keep producing, and its rulers have to convince everyone that they remain capable of holding the whole arrangement together. Then, beginning in the later classic period, the climate appears to have become less forgiving. The evidence comes from places that preserve long environmental records. Stalagmites in caves grow slowly, layer by layer, as minerals carried by dripping water are deposited. The chemistry of those layers can provide clues about past rainfall. Lake sediments preserve traces of changing water levels, erosion, vegetation, and drought. Records from lakes in the Yucatan and elsewhere in the Maya region point to repeated dry intervals, including significant drought episodes during the centuries when many southern lowland kingdoms were under severe strain. The broad pattern is difficult to ignore between roughly the 9th and 11th centuries. Parts of the Maya world experience periods of reduced rainfall. Some droughts may have lasted several years. Others may have involved repeated dry seasons spread across decades. In certain records, the dry conditions were especially pronounced around the time many classic centres stopped raising monuments and lost political power. That correlation matters, but correlation is not a complete explanation. Paleoclimate records do not tell us that every Maya city received exactly the same amount of rain in the same year. They do not show one giant drought sweeping evenly across a map and causing every kingdom to fail in identical fashion. Climate varies from place to place, so do soils, water sources, population densities, political systems, and local decisions. Some cities had access to wetlands that held moisture longer. Some were near rivers or springs. Some had larger or better maintained reservoirs. Some may have had stronger trade connections, allowing food or goods to move in during difficult years. In the northern lowlands, communities could sometimes draw on cenotes and underground water sources that were less available in parts of the south. Even rainfall itself was not the only issue. A season with normal total rainfall could still be disastrous if rain fell at the wrong time. Too much arriving in violent storms could wash away soil and damage crops. Too little during the planting season could prevent maize from establishing. A long, dry spell at the wrong point in the growing cycle could turn an apparently manageable shortage into hunger. And drought could trigger other problems. Food scarcity could make tribute harder to collect. It could increase migration from rural areas toward protected centres, placing further pressure on urban water supplies. It could sharpen disputes between neighbouring kingdoms competing for fertile land, trade routes, and dependable water. It could make subjects less willing to support rulers who continued demanding labour for monuments and war. In other words, drought was not necessarily the hand that destroyed the Maya cities. It may have been the pressure that exposed everything already weakening beneath the surface. A strained reservoir, an exhausted field, a failed alliance, a defeated king, a rival city watching from beyond the forest. The rains did not create every political conflict in the Maya world. But when the rains failed, conflicts that might once have been survivable could become much harder to contain. And in the late Classic period, the Maya kingdoms were not facing environmental stress in isolation. They were facing one another, and that is where the political map of the classic Maya becomes important. There was no single Maya emperor sitting in one distant capital, commanding every city from the Gulf Coast to the Caribbean. The Maya world was a patchwork of kingdoms: Tikal, Calakmul, Caracol, Naranjo, Copan, Palenque, Dos Pilas, Quirigua, and dozens of other royal courts, large and small, each centered on a dynasty that claimed sacred authority. Each had its own ruler, its own nobles, its own monuments, its own local gods and ancestral stories. Each wanted allies, each feared enemies, and each existed in a landscape where a neighbouring kingdom could become dangerous very quickly. For centuries, rivalry had been part of Maya political life. Kings went to war, they captured opponents, they marked victories on stone. This was not a peaceful world suddenly interrupted by violence. But during the later Classic period, warfare seems to have intensified. The inscriptions are unusually revealing. Maya scribes recorded military events with remarkable precision: attacks on cities, the capture of noble prisoners, the burning or destruction of places, the defeat of rulers. Sometimes a monument names the captive, the victorious king, and the exact date, all arranged with the confidence of a courtroom record carved into stone. A captured king was not simply an enemy soldier taken off a battlefield. He was a political catastrophe. Maya kings ruled through dynastic legitimacy. They claimed descent from revered ancestors. They performed rituals meant to connect the human world with gods, sacred time, and the forces that kept order in the universe. Their authority depended partly on practical things: food, tribute, military followers. But it also depended on belief. The king had to look favoured by the gods. If he was captured, humiliated, forced into submission, or killed, that sacred image could crack. A rival dynasty could then make a devastating argument without ever saying it directly. If your king could not protect himself, perhaps he could not protect the city. If he had lost a war, perhaps the ancestors had turned away. If another ruler had taken him prisoner, perhaps another ruler now possessed greater sacred power. So warfare was not only about land, it was about reputation. It was about ritual authority. It was about making people wonder whether the old dynasty still deserved obedience. And Maya kingdoms rarely fought alone. They formed alliance networks, sometimes lasting generations. The best-known great rivalry was between Tikal and Calakmul, two enormous powers whose influence reached far beyond their own walls. Rather than directly controlling every smaller city, they built webs of friendship, marriage, obligation, tribute, and military support. A local ruler might receive backing from Calakmul against an enemy. Another might turn to Tikal for protection. A marriage could bind courts together. A young prince could be installed with the support of a powerful outside king. But alliances could also pull small kingdoms into conflicts they had not begun. A dispute between two neighbouring cities could become part of a much larger struggle. It is a little like a forest fire moving through dry grass. The first spark may be local, but when the ground is ready, the fire follows connections that were already there. In the 7th century, for example, the kingdom of Dos Pilas in the Petx-Patun region became deeply entangled in this wider competition. Its history, preserved in inscriptions, includes changing alliances, dynastic conflict, attacks, defeats, and periods of instability. The region eventually became one of the clearest archaeological examples of late classic political stress. By the 8th and 9th centuries, more Maya centers were building or strengthening defenses. Archaeologists have identified walls, ditches, embankments, palisade lines, and defensible positions at a number of sites. At some places, settlements shifted toward hilltops, ridges, or locations easier to protect. In the Petx-Batun region, places such as Aguetica show substantial defensive works. At Aguetica, people appear to have left behind possessions in buildings, suggesting a sudden and violent disruption, though the exact sequence remains debated. The point is not that every Maya city became a fortress. Many did not, but the growing presence of fortifications tells us that rulers and communities increasingly expected danger. Labour that might once have gone into temples, roads, reservoirs, or fields could now be required for walls and watch points. Farmers may have needed to travel farther or work fields closer to protected settlements. People living in exposed hamlets may have moved toward defensible centres, abandoning parts of the countryside. And war could damage much more than buildings. A raiding force did not need to conquer an entire kingdom to cause hardship. It could burn fields, seize stored food, disrupt planting, capture labourers, block roads, or make travel unsafe. Merchants carrying obsidian, salt, cacao, feathers, pottery, or other valuable goods had to calculate the risk of moving through contested territory. Tribute could fail to arrive. Allied cities could be cut off. A defeated ruler might still sit on his throne, but with fewer goods to distribute and fewer followers willing to answer his call. This mattered especially during dry years. When harvests were poor, a kingdom had less surplus to feed its court, reward its allies, maintain its defences, and support its population. At the same time, neighbouring rulers faced the same scarcity. The temptation to seize land, water, captives, or tribute may have grown stronger. War could be a cause of political collapse, but it could also be a consequence of political stress. A ruler facing food shortages, angry nobles, or declining confidence might launch a campaign to demonstrate strength. Victory could bring captives, prestige, and perhaps access to resources. But defeat could make every existing problem worse. Even a victory could be expensive, consuming labour and provoking revenge. This created a dangerous cycle. Drought and scarcity strained kingdoms. Strained kingdoms fought harder. Warfare disrupted farming and trade. Disruption deepened scarcity. And as hardship spread, the sacred promises of kingship became more difficult to sustain. There were, in effect, too many kings in a crowded and vulnerable landscape, each needing to prove that his dynasty still stood at the centre of the world. And proving that claim required more labour, more ritual, more tribute, more monuments, and sometimes more war. That last requirement is easy to underestimate. A Maya king was not expected merely to rule. He was expected to make the world work. In the language of modern politics, a ruler needs legitimacy. He needs people to believe that he has the right to command labour, collect tribute, settle disputes, lead armies, and punish enemies. For a classic Maya king, legitimacy was even larger than that. He stood at the meeting point of history, ritual, weather, agriculture, warfare, and sacred time. He was the living representative of a dynasty whose ancestors were believed to remain active and powerful. He conducted ceremonies at crucial moments in the calendar. He spilled his own blood in rites meant to communicate with gods and ancestors. He dedicated buildings, he oversaw festivals, he received tribute. He led, or at least claimed credit for, military victories. And in return, people expected order, not necessarily comfort. Ancient life was never comfortable for everyone, but order. The rains should come often enough. The maize should grow. The reservoirs should hold water. Trade should move. Enemies should be held back. The gods should receive their offerings. The calendar should continue unfolding exactly as it had before. That is an enormous burden to place on one family, especially when the climate becomes less predictable, when food is harder to produce, and when rival kings are waiting for any sign of weakness. Maya monuments were part of how rulers carried that burden. A stone stela was not just a statue with writing on it. It was a public declaration. It named a king. It placed him within a royal genealogy. It recorded his accessions, victories, rituals, marriages, captives, and important calendar endings. It connected the ruler's short human life to cycles of time that stretched far beyond any one generation. Imagine standing in a city plaza during a major ceremony. Above you rise temple pyramids, built and rebuilt by generations of rulers. Around you are carved stones bearing the faces and names of earlier kings. Priests recite dates, nobles wear symbols of office. The current ruler performs rituals before an audience that may include farmers, artisans, merchants, visitors from allied cities, and people who have been ordered to bring tribute. The message is everywhere. This dynasty has always been here. This dynasty understands sacred time. This dynasty has the power to keep the connection between the human world and the cosmic order intact. A monument could make that message permanent, or at least as permanent as stone could be in a tropical forest. The Maya long count calendar was especially useful for this purpose. A king could dedicate a monument on the ending of a Katun, a period of roughly 20 years, or at other important calendrical moments. The date was not random. It announced that time had reached a meaningful turning point and that the king had properly marked it. In a stable kingdom that was reassuring, another cycle had ended. Another had begun. The ruler had performed his duties. The gods, ancestors, and living community remained connected. Whatever dangers existed beyond the city, the centre still held. But what happens when it does not? What happens when a Katun ending arrives after several years of poor harvests? What happens when the king calls for labour to raise another temple platform, carve another stela, stage another ceremony, and distribute food to guests, but households are already struggling to feed themselves? What happens when the same king has recently lost a battle, failed to protect an ally, or watched a rival capture one of his nobles? The monument that once displayed confidence could begin to expose vulnerability. Monument building required resources. Stone had to be quarried and moved. Sculptors and scribes needed support. Rituals required offerings, textiles, food, incense, precious feathers, painted pottery, and the labour of many people. A royal court did not operate on belief alone. It needed a flow of maize, water, work, and tribute coming into the city. During prosperous decades, this system could create something extraordinary. It concentrated wealth and labour into plazas, palaces, temples, reservoirs, roads, and works of art that still impress people more than 1,000 years later. But concentrated systems can become fragile. The more a king's authority depended on great public performances, the harder it became to reduce those performances when times were bad. A ruler who stopped building, stopped giving feasts, stopped appearing at ceremonies, or stopped claiming victories might save resources in the short term. But he might also appear unable to fulfill the role that made him king. It is like a ship's captain during a storm. The captain may know that supplies are running low. He may know the crew is frightened, but if he disappears below deck and says nothing, the silence itself becomes dangerous. Late classic inscriptions suggest that something like this was happening in parts of the Maya lowlands. For centuries, many courts had erected dated monuments with impressive regularity. Scholars can trace royal histories through these inscriptions: accessions, wars, alliances, rituals, anniversaries. Then, in the 8th and 9th centuries, the pattern begins to change. At some cities, dated monuments become less frequent. At others, they stop. The last known long count dates at different sites do not all fall in the same year. This matters. There was no single final day when every Maya city suddenly went dark. Some centres ceased erecting dated monuments earlier. Others continued longer. A few remained active into the early 10th century. The famous final dates on stone are therefore clues, not a stopwatch for collapse. When inscriptions stop, we cannot automatically conclude that every resident left the city that same year. Stone monuments may have ceased because a dynasty lost power, because a court could no longer command enough labour, because political authority shifted elsewhere, or because rulers no longer found the old public language useful. Writing may have continued on perishable materials that did not survive. Communities could remain nearby even after royal monument building ended. Silence in the inscriptions is not silence in human life. But it is still meaningful. A kingdom that no longer raised monuments in the old style may have been telling us, indirectly, that the old system of kingship was under strain. Perhaps there was no secure ruler to commemorate. Perhaps rival factions were fighting. Perhaps people could no longer spare the labour. Perhaps the ceremonies continued on a smaller scale without the massive carved statements of earlier centuries. And perhaps, after enough disappointments, the claim that one sacred king could guarantee cosmic order simply became harder to believe. That did not mean the Maya stopped believing in their gods, their ancestors, or the power of time. It may have meant that the old political machinery built around those beliefs was failing. The stone monuments had once promised continuity. Their gradual disappearance at many southern cities suggests not one sudden apocalypse, but a long and uneven loss of confidence, capacity, and royal authority. And as fewer kings marked the passage of time in stone, the dates that remained became strangely precious. They would be the last voices of certain dynasties, still naming their rulers, still counting the days, even as the world around them was beginning to change. The last voices of certain dynasties, that is what these monuments become. Not messages predicting the end, not warnings carved by kings who knew exactly what was coming, just formal records made in the old language of royal power, at a time when that language was beginning to disappear. For centuries the pattern had been familiar. A ruler came to the throne. He claimed descent from earlier kings. He fought wars, took captives, married into allied families, dedicated temples, performed bloodletting rites, and marked important turns in the calendar. Then a sculptor carved the event into stone. The date came first, often in the precise mathematics of the long count. Then came the king's name. Then the action. He ascended. He conquered. He dedicated. He scattered incense. He completed a Katun. He stood in effect at the centre of time. But by the late 8th century, and especially through the 9th, this steady rhythm begins to taper off across much of the southern lowlands. Not everywhere, not at once, and that unevenness is one of the most important parts of the story. It would be simpler if every Maya city had erected its final monument in the same year. We could point to one date, one drought, one invasion, one catastrophe, and say, there, that was the moment. But history almost never makes things that easy. At Palenque, in the western lowlands, the last known long count date falls in 799. The city had once been one of the great centres of classic Maya art and writing. Its rulers built elegant temples and recorded generations of dynastic history. Yet, after the end of the 8th century, its public inscription tradition fades from view. At Yaxchilan, deep along the Usumacinta River, the last securely dated monuments belong to the early 9th century, around 808. This had been a city of powerful kings, elaborate lintels, and military rivalry. Its buildings still preserve scenes of rulers and nobles performing ceremonies with extraordinary confidence. Then the carved historical record grows quiet. Quirigua, in what is now eastern Guatemala, produced some of the largest and most beautifully carved stelae in the Maya world. Its final known long count date is 810. Copan, its old rival and former overlord, continued a little longer, with its last dated monument in 822. Those dates are close together, but they are not identical, and elsewhere the old system held on. Caracol, in present-day Belize, recorded a date in 859. Tikal, one of the greatest cities of the central lowlands, erected its last known dated monument in 869. By then, the city had been a major political force for centuries. It had experienced defeats and recoveries, long rivalries and spectacular building campaigns. Yet even there, one of the greatest Maya capitals, the sequence of royal monuments eventually ended. Then there are the places that continued beyond the dates usually associated with the southern collapse. At Sable, on the Passion River, rulers were still erecting monuments in the late 9th century. One stela bears a date equivalent to 889. Another reaches 909. Tonina, farther west in Chiapas, also has inscriptions extending into the early 10th century. So when someone says the Maya collapse happened in the 9th century, that is useful as a broad summary. But it is not a single event written neatly into the calendar. It is more like watching lamps go out across a vast landscape. One city grows quiet early, another continues to hold ceremonies for another generation. Another survives through political reinvention, new alliances, or control of a useful trade route. Another still has a king, at least on paper, but no longer has the labour or wealth to raise a monumental stone in the old way. And this raises an important question. What does a final date on a monument actually mean? The honest answer is less than we might hope, and more than we should ignore. It does not necessarily mark the day a city was abandoned. A stela is an expensive object. It requires quarrying stone, transporting it, preparing its surface, employing a skilled sculptor, and supporting the court that commissions it. If no more stelae appear, that may mean the dynasty had lost wealth, or military power, or access to labour, or confidence in the old rituals of public kingship. But it does not prove that everyone vanished. People may have remained in and around the city. Families may have continued farming nearby. Local shrines may have remained active. Smaller leaders may have ruled without the resources or the desire to commission enormous carved monuments. Writing itself may have continued on bark paper, cloth, wood, plaster, or painted ceramics, materials far less likely to survive 1,000 years in a tropical environment. The stone record is durable precisely because it is unusual. It preserves the voices of elites better than the lives of ordinary people. That means the end of monument production tells us most clearly about royal courts. And royal courts were under pressure. A king who could no longer raise a stela was not simply failing to make art. He may have been unable to perform one of the central public acts of classic Maya rule. He could no longer announce in stone that he had properly met the turning of sacred time. Imagine the final ceremony at one of these cities. The plaza is still there, the temples still rise over the trees, priests still know the calendar, farmers still plant maize when the rains allow it. Children still run through courtyards, traders still carry goods along river routes and forest paths. But something has changed. Perhaps the ruler's court is smaller than it once was. Perhaps there are fewer nobles gathered beneath the palace roof. Perhaps tribute has fallen. Perhaps enemies control the roads. Perhaps food stores are thin. Perhaps people have begun leaving for safer places, places with more reliable water, more stable leadership, or fewer demands. The old monument tradition had been a declaration that the dynasty would endure. Its disappearance did not mean time itself had ended. The long count continued. The sun rose. The rains came or failed to come. Communities adapted, moved, endured, and remembered. But the stones stopped naming kings, and that silence is one of the clearest clues archaeologists possess. Not a final answer, not proof of one cause, but a pattern spread across many cities at roughly the same troubled moment. The public machinery of divine kingship, so confident for centuries, was losing its ability to speak. But if the stones stopped naming kings, where did the people go? This is where the old image of the Maya collapse becomes most misleading. For a long time, popular accounts imagined a single dramatic exodus. Great cities emptied, everyone fled into the forest. A civilization disappeared almost overnight, leaving temples behind for vines and silence. It is a powerful image. It is also almost certainly wrong. There was no universal moment when all Maya people packed up their homes and marched away from the southern lowlands. There was no single road crowded with refugees, no final year when millions vanished from the map. What happened appears to have unfolded over generations. A family leaves one district after a bad harvest. Another moves closer to a reliable spring. A household abandons an outlying farm and joins relatives near a defensible town. A local lord loses a war, and some of his followers move toward a neighbouring kingdom. A community that once supported a great palace continues living nearby, but no longer sends tribute to a king or gathers in the old plaza for grand ceremonies. Then the pattern repeats, year after year, dry season after dry season, conflict after conflict, until eventually the settlement map looks very different. Archaeologists can see parts of this transformation in the changing density of occupation. During the height of the Classic period, many areas of the southern lowlands were intensely settled. Not just the famous ceremonial centres, but the ridges, valleys, fields, reservoirs and forest edges around them. People lived in clusters of household compounds, connected by paths, terraces, canals and networks of farming land. As political systems weakened, some of those dense landscapes began to thin. The largest centres often lost population first, or at least lost the ability to hold together the large populations they had once supported. Palaces were no longer repaired, elite courtyards filled with debris. Reservoir systems received less maintenance. Buildings were altered, divided into smaller spaces, or reused in practical ways that had little to do with royal ceremony. But abandonment was rarely a clean process. People did not always walk away from a house and never return. They might use one part of a compound while another collapsed. They might move seasonally between fields and a more secure settlement. They might salvage cut stone from an old palace to build a smaller home, a wall, a storage platform, or a new shrine. They might continue visiting abandoned temples because those places still held the graves of ancestors and the memories of local gods. A city could decline as a capital without becoming empty, and a landscape could lose half its population without becoming a wilderness. This distinction matters because archaeology is very good at finding stone buildings, but much less good at following the quieter choices of ordinary families. A royal palace leaves thick walls and carved lintels. A farming household that moved 20 miles away may leave only broken pottery, a hearth, a few tools, and the faint outline of a foundation beneath the soil. Yet those small traces are exactly where survival becomes visible. In some regions, households seem to have adapted by becoming more flexible. Instead of relying on the demands of a distant court, people may have organized around smaller communities, kin groups, local ritual centers, and more manageable farming territories. They changed where they lived, they changed whom they obeyed. They may have changed what they grew, how they stored food, and how far they travelled to trade. The great political map was breaking apart, but the human map was being redrawn. Many people likely moved northward, toward the northern lowlands of the Yucatan Peninsula, where different water systems and different political centres offered possibilities that the troubled south no longer did. This did not mean the north was safe from drought or conflict. It was not. But communities there had long experience with a landscape shaped by shallow soils, seasonal rainfall caves and natural wells called cenotes. For people leaving parts of the central and southern lowlands, the north may have offered new connections, established towns, coastal trade, and access to water sources that were different from the reservoirs and seasonal wetlands of the south. Others moved toward the coasts. The Caribbean and Gulf lowlands were not empty edges of the Maya world. They were active corridors. Canoes could move salt, fish, shells, cacao, obsidian, pottery, cloth and messages between communities. Coastal settlements offered access to marine food and trade routes that did not depend entirely on contested inland roads. Still others likely moved into or toward the highlands, where cooler elevations, different rainfall patterns, and long-established communities created another set of options. The highlands had their own political struggles and environmental limits. Migration was not a journey from danger into paradise. It was a search for places where life could continue. And that search did not always involve moving far. Sometimes survival meant relocating from one valley to the next. Sometimes it meant leaving a grand city, but remaining within the same local region. Sometimes it meant joining family members in a town that had once been a trading partner, a rival, or a place barely mentioned in the royal histories. This is why the word collapse needs careful handling. The classic Maya system of divine kingship collapsed across much of the southern lowlands. Many great courts lost power. Monument building declined. Population fell in numerous regions. Cities that had dominated the landscape for centuries were no longer maintained in the same way. All of that is real, but Maya people did not disappear. They continued speaking Maya languages. They continued planting maize, beans, squash, chili, and other crops suited to their local environments. They continued counting time. They continued making offerings at caves, springs, household shrines, and old ceremonial places. They continued passing down stories of ancestors, places, obligations, and sacred landscapes. The languages alone tell us something important. Today, there are many Maya languages spoken across Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, Honduras, and El Salvador. They are not museum relics. They are living languages spoken by millions of people. Their diversity reflects a deep history of communities remaining in place, moving, separating, reconnecting, and adapting over centuries. The same is true of ritual and farming knowledge. Maya communities did not emerge from the 9th century as if they had forgotten everything that came before. They carried old practices into new political worlds. Some traditions changed, others blended with new influences. Some royal institutions disappeared, while local ceremonies endured with remarkable persistence. The civilization did not vanish into the forest. In many ways it became less concentrated, less centred on a few powerful courts, more dispersed across villages, market towns, coastal settlements, highland communities, and northern cities that would rise to prominence in the centuries ahead. And that northern story is crucial, because while many southern capitals were falling quiet, other Maya centres were not simply waiting for the end. They were preparing to become the places where Maya life continued. The north did not escape history. It had droughts. It had wars. It had abandoned buildings, failed dynasties, shifting trade routes, and political violence of its own. But it did not follow exactly the same path as the southern lowlands. And that difference is one of the strongest reasons to be careful with the idea that the Maya predicted one final universal collapse. Because while cities such as Tikal, Calakmul, Copan and Palenque were losing the systems that had sustained their royal courts, the northern Yucatan Peninsula was becoming more important. Not overnight. Not because the north was some untouched refuge where everything worked perfectly, but because it had different resources, different connections, and eventually different ways of organizing power. Picture the Maya world not as one empire with one capital, but as a vast patchwork of regions, forested lowlands in the south, highland valleys to the west, river systems, coasts, swamps, limestone plains, and dry northern scrublands. Communities across this enormous territory shared languages, rituals, trade goods, and ideas about time. But they did not all depend on the same water sources, the same rulers, or the same political arrangements. That mattered when conditions became difficult. In much of the southern lowlands, large cities depended on collecting rainwater. There were seasonal wetlands, rivers in some regions, and impressive systems of reservoirs, canals, dams, and household storage. Maya engineers were extremely skilled at managing water. They shaped plazas to direct runoff. They lined reservoirs. They built channels. They created landscapes capable of supporting dense populations. But these systems required maintenance. A reservoir has to be cleaned. Its walls have to be repaired. Its catchment area has to be protected. The labour needed to keep water flowing was often organised through the same royal institutions that were being weakened by drought, warfare, and political rivalry. When kings lost authority, water systems could become harder to maintain. And when rainfall failed repeatedly, even the best reservoir had limits. Northern Yucatan had water problems too. In many ways, it was even more dependent on seasonal rain. There are few rivers across much of the peninsula. The limestone bedrock lets water drain away quickly. Thin soils can make farming difficult, but the north also had cenotes. These are natural sinkholes and water-filled openings in the limestone connected to the vast underground water system beneath the Yucatan. Some cenotes were deep, dark wells. Others opened into broad pools. Some were sacred places associated with rain, ancestors, and the underworld. Others were practical sources of water for daily life. A town built near dependable cenotes had an advantage. Not immunity, not unlimited water. Severe drought could still lower water levels, damage crops, and create hunger. But a different kind of water landscape offered different possibilities. Communities were not relying entirely on the same combination of reservoirs, seasonal wetlands, and centralized management found farther south. And water was only one part of the story. The north was also connected to trade. Its coastlines faced the Gulf of Mexico and the Caribbean. Canoes moved along the shores, carrying salt, fish, cotton, cacao, obsidian, shells, pottery, feathers, and all the small valuable things that keep distant communities linked together. Coastal trade did not replace farming. Nobody can eat a cargo of jade. But trade brought wealth, information, allies, and access to resources from far beyond local fields. A northern city could be tied not only to its immediate farming district, but to ports, markets, and exchange routes reaching across Mesoamerica. That network became increasingly important after the great southern courts began to weaken. Centres such as Uxmal rose to prominence during the late Classic and Terminal Classic periods. Uxmal, with its carefully planned architecture and elaborate stone mosaics, was not a simple continuation of the old southern model. It was a powerful northern capital, but it developed in its own landscape, drawing on local water storage systems, regional farming communities, and changing political alliances. Then came Chichen Itza. Its story is complicated, and scholars still debate exactly how its government worked. But by roughly the 9th and 10th centuries, Chichen Itza had become one of the most influential cities in the Maya world. It was large, cosmopolitan, and connected. Its architecture shows Maya traditions alongside styles linked to central Mexico. Its markets and trade networks seem to have reached widely. Its location gave it access to cenotes, including the famous sacred cenote, where offerings were made for centuries. Chichen Itza did not preserve the old world unchanged. It represented a new one. The old pattern of divine kings raising carved monuments to celebrate personal dynastic victories became less central in some northern places. Political authority may have been shared among elite lineages, military leaders, merchant groups, or councils in ways that are still difficult to reconstruct. The evidence is incomplete. Stone inscriptions are fewer. Later accounts must be used cautiously, but the broad pattern is clear enough. Maya political life was changing. The north did not simply inherit the southern lowland system after it failed. It developed different versions of Maya power, and even Chichen Itza was not permanent. By the 11th century, its influence declined. Other centers rose. Centuries later, Mayapan became an important northern capital, especially from around the 13th through 15th centuries. Mayapan was smaller than Chichen Itza, but it was heavily fortified and densely built. It appears to have been governed through a more collective and lineage-based political order, though the exact details remain debated. Again, the pattern is not one of uninterrupted success. Uxmal declined. Chichen Itza declined. Mayapan eventually fell into conflict and was abandoned as a major capital. The north had its own cycles, but those cycles unfolded across different centuries. That chronology is crucial. If the Maya had possessed one clear prophecy announcing that all Maya civilization would end at a particular moment, the survival and later growth of northern centers would be difficult to explain. While southern dynasties were collapsing in the 9th century, other Maya communities were adapting, trading, building and creating new political centers. The disaster was real, but it was regional, uneven and spread across time. Some cities fell early, others persisted. Some regions lost population, others gained migrants. Some forms of kingship ended, other forms of authority took their place. Maya civilization did not move toward one single cliff. It moved through a long period of transformation. The great southern capitals were not the whole Maya world, even when they were at their most powerful. Their decline was a profound rupture, but beyond their empty plazas, people were still planting fields, drawing water from cenotes, travelling by canoe, making offerings, telling old stories, and building new cities. And that survival changes the meaning of every supposed prediction. Perhaps Maya scribes could recognize danger. Perhaps they saw cycles of drought, war, political failure, and renewal. Perhaps later generations looked back at ruined cities and found patterns in the losses. But the evidence does not point to a people calmly recording the date of their own extinction. It points to something more human, a civilization under pressure, changing shape, moving northward and outward, losing old worlds while making new ones. And that brings us to one of the strangest afterlives of the Maya calendar. For more than 1,000 years, carved dates sat quietly on monuments in the forests of southern Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, and Honduras. They recorded births, accessions, wars, rituals, victories, defeats, and the endings of important time periods. Then, in the late 20th century, those dates entered popular culture. A complex calendar system became a countdown, and one future date, written by Maya scribes more than 13 centuries ago, became attached to the idea that the world would end on December 21, 2012. You may remember the mood. Books appeared claiming that the Maya had foreseen global catastrophe. Television specials spoke of planetary alignments, solar storms, magnetic reversals, hidden planets, ancient prophecies, and a final day when civilization itself would be swept away. The internet, which is very good at turning uncertainty into certainty, carried the story everywhere. But the Maya calendar did not say the world would end in 2012. The date came from the long count, the system Maya scribes used to track enormous spans of time. In that system, days were arranged into larger and larger units. A kin was 1 day, a winnow was 20 days, a ton was 360 days, a Katun was 7,200 days, almost 20 years, and a Baktun was 144,000 days, just under 400 years. 13 Baktuns made a major cycle. The date we call December 21, 2012, using the most widely accepted conversion, marked the completion of 13 Baktuns since a mythic starting point in 3114 BCE. That sounds dramatic if you call it a final deadline. But imagine an odometer in a car. When it reaches 99,999 miles, the numbers do not announce the destruction of the vehicle. They turn over. A new sequence begins. The car may have problems, of course. It may need fuel, repairs, or a very patient mechanic. But the number itself is not a prophecy of disaster. For the Maya, period endings were important. They were moments for ceremony, commemoration, and renewal. A completed cycle could carry religious weight. It could be an occasion to honor gods, ancestors, and rulers. But importance is not the same thing as apocalypse. The most famous inscription connected with 2012 comes from a modest site in the Mexican state of Tabasco called Tortuguero. On Monument 6, a damaged text refers to the ending of the 13th Baktun. Much of the final passage is broken. That damage has created room for argument, translation, and imagination. But the surviving words appear to mention a deity known as Bolon Yokti, whose name is often associated with change, transition, or a group of divine powers. The inscription does not say oceans will rise. It does not say the sun will explode. It does not say humanity will vanish. It describes a future ritual event in language that is difficult to reconstruct completely because the stone is damaged. That is all. And there is another detail that tends to disappear from end-of-the-world documentaries. Maya scribes wrote dates far beyond 2012. At Palenque, inscriptions project forward thousands of years, linking the reign of King Pakal to dates so distant they reach into what, on our calendar, would be the 8th millennium. These were not anxious predictions of an approaching final darkness. They were demonstrations of sacred time on a huge scale. They placed kings and gods within cycles so vast that one human lifetime became almost impossibly small. The future, to Maya scribes, was not a wall. It was part of the landscape of time. So where does the claim about predicting their own collapse 400 years in advance come from? Usually it comes from several different ideas being blended together until they sound like one discovery. A Baktun lasts almost 400 years. The great political decline of many southern lowland cities unfolded mainly between the late 8th and 10th centuries. Maya inscriptions also contain calculations reaching hundreds of years backward and forward. And later Maya texts, especially the books of Chilam Balam, contain prophecies organized around Katun cycles, linking periods of time with themes of war, hunger, political change, and misfortune. Put those pieces together carelessly, and it is easy to produce a dramatic sentence. The Maya knew a cycle was ending. They described disaster. Their cities later declined. Therefore, they predicted the collapse 4 centuries beforehand. But that final step is not supported by the evidence. No known classic Maya inscription plainly says that the southern lowland kingdoms will collapse at a specific future date. No surviving text gives us a clear warning such as, 400 years from now, The kings will lose their cities, the reservoirs will fail, the wars will intensify, and the population will scatter. If such a text existed, it would be among the most important documents in ancient American history. It does not. That does not mean Maya people were incapable of recognizing danger. They lived close to rainfall, harvests, trade routes, military alliances, and the fragile authority of kings. They could see drought. They could see fields failing. They could see enemies gathering, captives being taken, and rulers losing the ability to provide. And they understood that time brought recurrence. A Katun could be remembered as a period of abundance, or warfare, or political upheaval. Later communities looking back on ruined cities could interpret past suffering through the patterns of their calendars. That is a reasonable possibility. But recognizing cycles is different from accurately forecasting a specific collapse centuries ahead. This is where scholarly uncertainty can feel less satisfying than a dramatic prophecy. Scholars must say when an inscription is damaged. They must admit when a word has several possible meanings. They must separate what a text literally says from what later readers wish it had said. Sensational stories do the opposite. They take a broken phrase, a mysterious calendar, and a real historical disaster, then connect them with a line so smooth it hides all the missing evidence. The Maya left us remarkable records of time. They did not leave us a simple message saying that their world was destined to end. So, if the Maya did not leave behind a neat prophecy of their own collapse, what can we say with confidence? Quite a lot, actually, just not the thing people most want to hear. The strongest evidence tells us that Maya scribes could think across enormous distances of time. They did not simply record the date of a king's accession or the number of days since a battle. They worked with calendars capable of reaching backward into mythic creation and forward into futures no living person could expect to see. At Palenque, scribes connected the reign of Pakal, a king who died in the 7th century, to dates thousands of years beyond his lifetime. Other inscriptions placed local events inside deep sequences of cosmic time. These calculations were not accidental. They required trained specialists, careful mathematics, durable writing systems, and courts willing to support people whose work involved events beyond the horizon of ordinary human experience. The Maya could imagine the distant future. That much is clear. They also treated the passing of time as meaningful. The end of a Katun, almost 20 years, or a Baktun, almost 400 years, was not just another number on a ledger. Period endings were moments when the world needed attention. Rulers performed ceremonies, monuments were raised, captives might be displayed, ancestors and gods were invoked. The passage of time was something that had to be marked, managed, and renewed. Think of it less like checking the date on a phone, and more like maintaining a great machine. The machine was the ordered universe. The gears were days, seasons, celestial movements, rituals, dynasties, harvests, and human obligations. If one gear slipped, perhaps through failed rain, political disorder, neglected offerings, or military defeat, the problem did not remain in one place. It could spread through the whole system. This does not mean the Maya believed a mist ceremony literally caused a drought. Their beliefs were more complex than that, and they varied across regions and centuries. But it does mean that political authority, sacred duty, and environmental stability were closely connected in Maya thought. A king was not merely a mayor with a crown. He was expected to stand at the meeting point of earth, sky, ancestors, and community. He led rituals, commissioned monuments, made war, took captives, oversaw alliances, and presented himself as someone capable of maintaining balance. When rains came, harvests succeeded, and enemies were defeated. This ideology could look very convincing. When rains failed, harvests shrank, and enemies began burning nearby towns. it could become dangerously difficult to sustain. And we have evidence that exactly these pressures were building in many parts of the classic Maya lowlands. Environmental records from lake sediments, cave formations, and other natural archives indicate that parts of the Maya region experienced repeated droughts during the centuries, when many southern lowland cities were under severe strain. The timing does not line up perfectly everywhere. The Maya world was enormous, and no single climate record can speak for every valley, forest, or reservoir. But the broad pattern is difficult to ignore. Rainfall became less reliable. For a society dependent on seasonal rain, that was a serious problem. Much of the central lowlands lacked large, permanent rivers. Cities stored water in reservoirs, reshaped wetlands, managed soils, and depended on a long history of agricultural knowledge. In good years, these systems supported dense populations and spectacular urban centres. In bad years, they could become vulnerable very quickly. A drought is not simply a lack of rain, it is a chain reaction. First, crops grow poorly, then stored food becomes precious. Water levels fall. Labour becomes harder to organise. Trade routes may weaken as every community holds tighter to its own supplies. Rulers face greater demands at the exact moment their ability to meet those demands is shrinking. Families may leave farms, move closer to water, or migrate towards safer regions. Conflict becomes more likely because the same resources now matter more. And drought was not acting alone. The final centuries of the classic period were marked by intensifying warfare among rival kingdoms. Inscriptions from the 8th century record attacks, captures, defeats, and the humiliation of kings. Some cities that had once been major powers disappeared from the historical record. Others survived briefly under new rulers. Fortifications appeared in places where earlier generations had invested more heavily in open ceremonial architecture. The political landscape was becoming crowded, competitive, and unstable. For centuries, Maya kings had built authority through a system of rivalry. They raised monuments to commemorate victories. They forged alliances through marriage and diplomacy. They captured high-status enemies. They claimed ancient ancestry and divine favour. This system could produce astonishing art and architecture. But it also created pressure to keep performing success. Every king needed legitimacy. Every court needed resources. Every defeat could become an invitation for a rival to strike. Now imagine that system during a prolonged period of poor rainfall. A ruler who once had enough maize to feed workers, enough water to sustain a city, and enough wealth to reward allies, might suddenly have far less of everything. He still had ceremonies to perform. He still had nobles to satisfy. He still had enemies watching from nearby kingdoms. And he may have faced subjects who no longer believed that the old promises were working. That is how a resilient system can become brittle. Not because everyone wakes up one morning and decides to abandon civilization, but because one problem makes another problem harder to solve. Drought weakens food production. Food shortages weaken rulers. Weak rulers invite rebellion or attack. Warfare disrupts farming and trade. Disrupted trade makes shortages worse. Communities move away. The labour needed to maintain reservoirs, terraces, buildings, and political institutions becomes harder to gather. Eventually, a city that had survived many earlier crises may reach a point where recovery is no longer possible. This is what historians mean when they speak cautiously about a collapse. Not the disappearance of Maya people, not the sudden extinction of a civilization, and not one single cause operating like a switch. It was the transformation of a political world. Many southern lowland dynasties stopped raising dated monuments. Royal courts lost power. Some great cities were gradually depopulated. Trade patterns changed, people moved, new centres rose elsewhere. Maya languages, families, beliefs, farming traditions and communities continued. The old order weakened, the Maya endured. And this brings us back to the question of prediction. No surviving classic period source clearly tells us that Maya thinkers forecast this particular political transformation centuries in advance. There is no inscription saying that a certain Katun would bring the end of Tikal, Calakmul, Copan, Palenque, or the many other kingdoms caught in the crisis. There is no known text that lays out drought, war, dynastic failure, and migration as a precise future sequence. We should be careful here, because absence of evidence is not evidence that nobody ever thought about danger. Maya people were intelligent observers of their world. They watched the sky with extraordinary patience. They measured time with great precision. They saw the behavior of clouds, crops, rivers, forests, and seasons. They remembered wars. They remembered the rise and fall of ruling houses. They lived in a landscape filled with older ruins, abandoned buildings, and the traces of previous generations. They knew that prosperity was not permanent. They knew that rulers could fail. They knew that rain could vanish, and they may well have understood these things through cyclical time, not as a modern forecast with a date, a chart, and a probability percentage, but as a moral and sacred pattern. Times of abundance could be followed by times of hardship. Powerful houses could rise and fall. A completed period could demand renewal, because renewal was never guaranteed. That is a subtler idea than prophecy, but in some ways it is more interesting. A prophecy says the future has already been written. A cyclical understanding of time says that vulnerability is always present. It says a community must remember what happened before. It must honour obligations, it must prepare for change. It must not confuse temporary success with permanent safety. The Maya did not need to predict one exact collapse 400 years ahead to understand that worlds can become unstable. Their monuments, their calendars, their rituals, and their political traditions all show a civilization deeply concerned with continuity. And people become concerned with continuity when they know it can be broken. Perhaps that is the real lesson hidden beneath the dramatic claim. The Maya left no surviving countdown to their own destruction. But they did leave a record of people who thought seriously about time, crisis, renewal, and the burden of preserving order in an uncertain world. And after many of their great southern cities fell quiet, they left something even more important. They left descendants. They left memory. They left a future that did not look like the past, but was still unmistakably Maya. And that future is still here. It lives in the Maya communities of southern Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, Honduras, and El Salvador. It lives in more than 30 Maya languages, still spoken by millions of people. It lives in weaving patterns, farming practices, ceremonies, stories, family names, and in the knowledge of landscapes that outsiders once imagined had been empty jungle. They were never empty. The great stone cities may have changed. Their royal courts may have fallen silent. The dynasties that commissioned towering temples, painted palace walls, and carved the names of their ancestors into limestone did not last forever. But the people did. That distinction matters. For a long time, the word collapse encouraged a misleading image. It suggested that the Maya simply vanished, as though one of the most remarkable civilizations in the ancient Americas had stepped into the forest and disappeared without a trace. But that is not what happened. Many southern lowland cities lost population. Royal authority fragmented. The old pattern of competing divine kings and monument-building courts weakened dramatically. Some places were abandoned, others survived in altered form. People moved toward regions with more reliable water, stronger trade connections, or new political opportunities. And in the north, cities such as Chichen Itza and later Mayapan became important centers in a changing Maya world. The future did not stop, it changed direction. That may be the strangest thing about reading Maya inscriptions today. A scribe sits in a palace courtyard more than 1,000 years ago. He prepares a stone monument for a ruler whose power seems permanent. He writes the date of a victory, an accession, a ceremony, an anniversary. And then, almost casually, he may connect that moment to a date far beyond his own lifetime. Beyond the lifetime of his king, beyond the lifetime of his kingdom, beyond the life of the city itself. At Palenque, the calculations associated with the ruler Pakal reached thousands of years into what was, for him, an unimaginable future. The city that supported those scribes eventually declined. Its temples were reclaimed by forest. Its royal line ended. The hands that carved those dates became dust. But the date kept going. That is the quiet power of a calendar. A calendar does not promise that the people using it will remain unchanged. It does not guarantee that kingdoms will survive, it simply continues, day after day, carrying time onward through droughts, wars, migrations, recoveries, and new beginnings. The Maya understood this better than almost anyone. They had calendars of astonishing complexity. They tracked solar years, ritual cycles, lunar patterns, Venus movements, and long sequences of days extending deep into the past and far into the future. Their scribes could perform calculations that still impress modern scholars. Their inscriptions show a disciplined intellectual tradition built over centuries, maintained by people who believed that time had structure and that human beings had obligations within it. That sophistication was real. The future dates were real. The careful mathematics was real, but a precise prediction of the classic Maya collapse, 400 years before it happened, remains unproven. There is no surviving inscription that gives us the dramatic message people sometimes want to find. No stone says, in effect, beware, in 4 centuries the cities will empty, the kings will fail, the reigns will weaken, and the old world will come apart. History is usually less neat than that, and perhaps more human. The Maya did not need a single written forecast to recognize that time could bring danger. They lived with seasonal uncertainty. They saw rulers rise and fall. They knew that warfare could erase a dynasty. They understood that rainfall, harvests, political order, and sacred duty were connected in ways that mattered deeply to everyday life. Their calendars may not have predicted one specific collapse, but their civilization was built around a truth that every society eventually learns. Nothing stable is guaranteed to stay stable. A full reservoir can fall low. A powerful ruler can lose allies. A rich field can produce less than it did before. A city that seems eternal can become a place people remember rather than a place they live. The Maya world changed because many pressures came together. Environmental stress, population demands, political rivalry, warfare, shifting trade, local decisions, and the limits of systems that had once been remarkably successful. The result was not one moment of destruction, but a long transformation unfolding differently from place to place. Some cities fell quiet, some communities moved, some traditions adapted. Some centers grew stronger, and Maya people continued making futures. Maybe that is the final lesson of those distant inscriptions. Not that the Maya knew exactly what would happen to them, but that they understood time was larger than any one ruler, any one city, or any one generation. They carved dates beyond themselves because the world was expected to continue. And it did. It continued through the decline of the classic courts, through the arrival of new powers, through conquest, disease, colonial rule, and centuries of outside attempts to define Maya people as part of a vanished past. Still the Maya are here, still speaking, still remembering, still counting the days. So as we leave the old cities beneath the trees, Perhaps the most interesting question is not whether the Maya predicted their own collapse. Perhaps it is this: when a society begins to notice the warning signs around it, changing weather, growing inequality, conflict, pressure on food and water, leaders who can no longer keep old promises, what does it do with that knowledge? Does it prepare? Does it adapt? Does it listen? Or does it keep building monuments to a version of the world that is already beginning to fade? The Maya cannot answer that question for us, but their long history reminds us to ask it. If you enjoyed this quiet journey through Maya time, please like the video, comment and subscribe for more history to help you rest. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from tonight. It is always wonderful to see how far these old stories travel. And if you would like to support the channel in the best possible way, listen on Spotify through the link in the description. For now, thank you for listening. The calendar keeps turning, and somewhere beneath the forest canopy, the old stones are still counting.